Hello, fellow Sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to meet your ancestors. Imagine this. The Ice Age is ending. The winds that once howled across the Levant are softening. Wild wheat grows in golden waves across the hills of southern Anatolia. Gazelles still run in herds, aurochs graze, vultures circle high in a pale sky. There are no villages yet, no kings, no ploughs, just small bands of hunter-gatherers moving through the grasslands, following seasons, rivers and herds. And yet, here, on a limestone ridge above the plain, they begin to drag stones heavier than elephants and carve them into pillars shaped like human bodies. The year is roughly 9,600 before the Common Era, and what they build will change the meaning of humanity itself. The site we now call Göbekli Tepe, the Belly Hill, stands silent in southeastern Turkey near the city of Şanlıurfa. Beneath layers of soil that hid it for millennia lies something almost unthinkable for its time, circular enclosures of towering T-shaped limestone pillars, each weighing up to 20 tons, arranged with mathematical symmetry and carved with foxes, boars, snakes, vultures, and lions. There are no signs of farming, no pottery, no metal, no permanent dwellings. This is not a village. It is a place built to gather, to remember, to perform something we no longer fully understand. And it was built more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge. Archaeologists first uncovered it in the 1990s, under the direction of Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute. What they found overturned almost everything once believed about the origins of complex society. For decades, it was thought that agriculture came first, that farming allowed people to settle, and only then did they build temples. Göbekli Tepe reversed that logic. Here, it seems that the temple came first, and maybe the farming followed. When you look at those pillars, you realise they are not random stones. Each one has a pair of carved arms folded across its chest, and, in some, a simple belt with a hanging loincloth. These are not gods, they're humans, or something between human and divine. The reliefs of animals crawl across their surfaces like stories told in a language of stone. Foxes glide along one pillar, cranes and snakes entwine on another. It feels like a memory of a world still half wild, half symbolic, a world where the line between animal and person had not yet hardened. The people who carved these stones used flint chisels, hammer stones, and an extraordinary sense of design. Limestone is soft enough to shape but hard enough to endure, and each pillar was quarried from the bedrock nearby. Some still lie half-cut in the quarries around the site, as if work stopped suddenly. Archaeologists believe the builders could have used ropes, wooden sleds, and teams of people to move each megalith into place. It would have taken hundreds of coordinated individuals living in temporary camps, sharing food, water, and purpose. So who were they? The bones scattered through the site show gazelles, onagers, red deer, wild sheep, and boar. Hunted animals, not domestic ones. The tools found are flint blades and projectile points typical of late Pleistocene hunter-gatherers, not farmers. And yet these same nomads organised one of the largest construction efforts of prehistory. That alone suggests something profound had shifted in human cognition and cooperation. They were no longer building just to survive. They were building to mean something. What made them do it? Some archaeologists suggest that ritual gatherings were the catalyst, that groups came together seasonally to perform feasts, ceremonies, or ancestor rites. Others believe it was part of an emerging social glue that held larger communities together after the climate shocks of the Younger Dryas, a cold period that had just ended. The earth was warming again, new plants and animals were spreading across the Fertile Crescent. Stability was returning, and with it came the ability to plan, to gather in larger numbers, and perhaps to dream of permanence. Göbekli Tepe's carving seemed to echo the fears and reverence of that liminal age. Snakes coil beside vultures, scorpions guard entrances, boars face the sun. The imagery is not random. It feels coded, as if each animal represented a season, a direction, or a myth. Some pillars even depict headless human figures beneath vultures, perhaps reflecting rituals of excarnation, where the dead were left for birds before their bones were collected. Death, fertility, and rebirth. These were the earliest cosmologies etched into stone. The layout of each enclosure is precise. Pillars are arranged in circles, with two central monoliths facing each other, possibly representing duality, life and death, male and female, earth and sky. Around them, smaller stones form a ring, like witnesses or participants in a ceremony. Archaeologists believe these enclosures were intentionally buried after use, covered with debris and stone fill before new circles were built on top. It's as if each generation sealed its monument, layered memory upon memory, creating a hill that rose with time, a stratigraphy of belief. When Schmidt excavated it, he called Göbekli Tepe the world's first cathedral on a hill. But that phrase, while poetic, might still be too modern. This was not organised religion as we understand it. There were no priests, no written doctrine, no hierarchy we can prove. It was more likely a shared space of awe, what prehistorians sometimes call a ritual aggregation site, where multiple groups gathered for reasons both social and sacred. Imagine hundreds of people arriving from distant valleys, bringing food, tools, obsidian and stories, exchanging ideas under the shadow of towering stones. For a brief time each year, the human world became something larger than survival. Then, after perhaps 15 centuries of use, it was buried. Around 8,000 years before the Common Era, its builders covered the pillars completely with soil and rubble, preserving them almost perfectly. Why they did so remains a mystery. Some think it was an act of reverence, like closing a tomb. Others suggest they were making way for new forms of settlement, as farming slowly began to take root in the region. The people who once hunted gazelle may have turned to tending grain in the nearby plains, carrying the memory of those stones within them. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe might have been both an ending and a beginning, the last monument of the purely wild human and the first of the settled one. Its builders may have come to see that meaning could be built, not just imagined, that memory could live outside the mind, in stone. Once that idea existed, it would never die. Every later temple, pyramid, or cathedral carries a trace of that first realization. There's a quiet irony here. The site that started our story of civilization also marks its greatest humility. The people who raised these stones had no writing to explain them, no technology to preserve them, and yet their work has outlived entire empires. They likely never intended to speak to us, and still, here we are, thousands of years later, listening through the soil. Scientists are still studying the details, carbon dates from charcoal and bone fragments, microscopic residue on tools, isotopic evidence suggesting feasting, the absence of domestic plant pollen that confirms this was pre-agricultural. Excavations continue to reveal smaller, later enclosures nearby, hinting that Göbekli Tepe was part of a much larger ritual landscape. And as LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar survey more of the plateau, dozens of unexcavated circles lie waiting beneath the earth, an entire complex hidden by time. What makes this story haunting is not just how old it is, but how familiar it feels. The urge to gather, to create something bigger than the self, to honour life through architecture, those are still human instincts. We still build to remember, and we still bury what we can't explain. In that way, the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not strangers. They were simply us, before the noise, before the nations, carving permanence into impermanence. When you think about it, every civilization since has been trying to do what they did, to leave a mark that might outlast the body. Stone was their language, geometry their faith. Perhaps that's why standing among those pillars today feels less like visiting ruins and more like entering a mind. An ancient thought still half awake. The deeper the archaeologists dig, the more the site expands. What once seemed a single sanctuary may in fact be dozens, some still untouched. And surrounding it, archaeobotanical traces of wild grains suggest the first steps toward domestication. People experimenting with controlling nature. It's tempting to think that the gatherings at Göbekli Tepe created the social networks that made farming possible. But we can't know for sure. The evidence whispers, not shouts. In the end, all we can say with certainty is this: 9,600 years before the present, somewhere between the last hunters and the first farmers, people carved their beliefs into stone. They faced the rising sun, gathered their strength, and built something meant to last longer than their bones. And in that act they became ancestors not just of agriculture or architecture, but of meaning itself. If you ever stand there on that hill of wind and dust, surrounded by stones that still watch the horizon, you might feel a strange stillness. The air is heavy, not with mystery but with recognition. You're seeing the first proof that humanity once looked beyond survival and chose memory instead. And maybe that is what makes Göbekli Tepe sacred. Not to them, but to us. It reminds us that curiosity built civilization long before certainty did. This is Sleepless Homo, a quiet corner of the internet where science slows down and time stretches beyond memory. Here we wander through deep history, one calm story at a time, from the first sparks of civilization to the silence between the stars. If you're listening while falling asleep, working late, or driving through the dark, you're in good company. I make these stories for minds that can't quite switch off. Imagine descending into a hollow carved entirely by human hands, an oval chamber sunk deep into limestone, silent, breathless, older than almost anything else built by us. The air is still, and on the wall ahead of you, a human face stares from the stone itself. Its eyes are blank, its lips pressed tight, its body half emerging from the bedrock as if caught between the worlds. This is Karahan Tepe, a sanctuary of faces buried beneath 10,000 years of soil and silence, where people who had no cities, no writing, and no metal somehow mastered the art of carving identity out of the earth. Karahan Tepe lies roughly 50 kilometres east of modern-day Şanlıurfa, on the same limestone plateau that once carried migrating herds and seasonal rivers across southeastern Anatolia. It dates between 9,400 and 9,000 years before the Common Era, a time when climate stability had just returned after the Long Ice Age, and humans were still learning what permanence meant. The site was rediscovered only recently, after decades of quiet erosion kept it hidden. Excavations began in earnest in the 2010s under the supervision of the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism and the Pre-Pottery Neolithic Research Project, revealing a vast complex of subterranean architecture that makes even seasoned archaeologists pause in disbelief. Unlike many other prehistoric sanctuaries, Karahan Tepe is built downward. Its most famous chamber is elliptical, more than 20 metres across, surrounded by carved stone pillars rising from bedrock. Each pillar was not placed into the earth, it was carved out of it, left standing as the floor was hollowed around them. This choice alone suggests extraordinary vision. They were shaping a temple from a single block of land, sculpting negative space as if to bring the earth itself alive. Along the walls, archaeologists have found an array of carved heads, human and animal, embedded into the plaster and stone. One head is life-sized, male, bald, with deeply cut eyes and a neutral expression. Another appears to rise from the wall like a ghost, mouth open as if speaking from limestone. These faces are some of the earliest examples of representational human sculpture ever found, predating most known attempts at portraiture by millennia. They are not decorative. They are deliberate presences, witnesses in stone. The centre of the main chamber is dominated by an enormous phallic pillar rising from the floor, encircled by 10 standing stones arranged in a deliberate oval. Some scholars interpret this central feature as a fertility symbol, others as a cosmic axis, an attempt to give physical form to reproduction, creation, or continuity. But beyond interpretation, what matters is the intent. People of that time were not only depicting animals and abstract forms, but beginning to carve the human self into the sacred landscape. This marks a major cognitive threshold, an early reflection of self-awareness, of body and symbol intertwined. Archaeologists working at the site have documented over 200 carved pillars, stone basins, stairways and channels, all interconnected through corridors and terraces. The complexity suggests long-term planning. People were coordinating quarrying, sculpting and construction on a scale unimaginable for small foraging groups. Yet there are no houses here, no hearths, no grain storage pits. It was not built to be lived in. It was built to be entered, experienced, and left. Microscopic analysis of tool marks reveals that each carved surface was shaped using flint and obsidian tools, hundreds of thousands of blows to the rock. Soil studies show very little domestic residue, but traces of animal bone and pigment fragments suggest ritual activity. One discovery, a stone bench or podium, implies a place of gathering or speaking, though no writing or engraving survived to tell us what was said. What we do know is that the builders understood acoustics. The chamber's curvature amplifies sound. Footsteps echo, voices carry in strange ways. To stand inside would have been to feel enclosed by an earthen heartbeat, surrounded by faces that could neither move nor look away. At a time when most of humanity still roamed the wild, Karahan Tepe represents something new, a culture experimenting with enclosure, with entering the earth rather than living atop it. Symbolically, that's a profound step inward. It suggests that spirituality, or perhaps early philosophy, was no longer just about the sky or the hunt, but about the human form and the interior world. The act of descending into stone, facing carved reflections of oneself, might have been the first metaphor for introspection ever built. Archaeologists studying the site have noted another remarkable detail: the careful use of symmetry and repetition. Pillars mirror each other. The faces appear in patterns. Reliefs of serpents and abstract lines follow rhythmic spacing along the walls. This implies an aesthetic grammar, a pre-linguistic form of order-shaping ritual architecture. Symbolic systems like these usually appear much later in human history, but here they seem already mature. It's as though people learn to think through pattern before they learn to record it. Dating methods, including radiocarbon samples from organic sediments, and optically stimulated luminescence of the surrounding soils, place Karahan Tepe firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic period. That means these builders had no ceramics, no woven cloth, no domesticated crops. Yet they understood geometry and shared symbolic conventions. Some researchers propose that groups from across the plateau gathered here, contributing labour seasonally, bringing with them regional motifs, faces, animals and phallic symbols unified into one vast sanctuary. It might have been a shared cultural meeting point before urban life existed. What fascinates researchers most is that the site remained active for centuries. Later layers reveal additional chambers, smaller shrines and refinements in carving skill. Each generation seemed to deepen the structure, literally cutting further into the limestone plateau, adding new reliefs, sealing older ones. This cycle of building and burying suggests a ritual dialogue with time itself. The site was not merely used, it was curated by memory. Recent discoveries have identified more than 24 stone heads, many detached from their bodies and deliberately placed in walls or cavities. Some may represent ancestors, others perhaps figures of authority, myth, or protection. The disembodied nature of these sculptures could reflect a worldview where identity existed beyond the body, where memory and presence lingered in material form. To a modern mind, these details seem eerie, but to their makers, they may have been acts of continuity, ensuring that the human face remained present even when the human had gone. As excavation expands, new features continue to surface. Stairways carved into rock, drainage channels and open-air terraces. A cluster of carved animal heads, including snakes and felines, adds further depth to the symbolic ecosystem of the site. The work is slow, meticulous, often interrupted by harsh seasons and fragile preservation. Every scrape of a trowel exposes not just soil, but the cognitive roots of civilization. When archaeologists describe Karahan Tepe, they often use the phrase Neolithic imagination. It's a convenient label for something we don't fully grasp. The first convergence of mind, landscape and symbolism in architecture. The builders weren't engineers, they were storytellers with stone. Each face, each pillar, each curve of the chamber speaks to a moment when the invisible became visible, when thoughts that could not yet be written were given shape. And then, like many sacred sites of deep prehistory, it was abandoned. There is no sign of violent destruction or catastrophe, just gradual infill and burial, the slow surrender of architecture to dust. Perhaps the rituals moved elsewhere. Perhaps belief itself changed. In the span of a few generations, the sanctuary of faces was forgotten. Millennia later, shepherds and wind flattened the land, unaware that beneath their feet lay the oldest human portrait gallery on Earth. Standing there today, surrounded by fragments of carved limestone, it's impossible not to feel a kind of humility. These were people who had no rulers, no armies, no written laws, and yet they possessed enough shared purpose to carve identity into rock. They didn't conquer the world, they built inside it. That is perhaps the most remarkable part of all. Meaning for them was not about domination, but participation. If you look at the site's central chamber from above, the oval floor almost resembles an eye. Its pillars rise like lashes from the rim, the central stone standing where a pupil might be. Whether by chance or intention, the effect is striking. A subterranean eye gazing upward through time. It reminds us that archaeology is not just about discovering ancient structures, but about being seen by them in return. Each head, each carved body fragment, each mark left by flint holds an echo of consciousness. Proof that before cities, before kings, before even domesticated crops, we were already aware of ourselves enough to ask what we were. That question, what are we really, is older than civilization. It was asked here, not with words, but with chisels. And maybe that's the quiet lesson buried in Karahan Tepe. The human story did not begin with the discovery of fire or the invention of agriculture. It began when we started looking inward, when we saw ourselves not just as animals surviving, but as beings capable of meaning. The people who carved these faces into the stone were already asking questions that science still asks today. Where does consciousness live, and how do we leave a trace of it? Their answers were not written, they were sculpted, and in their silence, they may be telling us something even now, that knowledge is not only about progress or technology, but about remembering what it means to be alive inside time. If you enjoy soft science and slow storytelling, a gentle like or subscribe helps other sleepless humans find their way here. And if you drift off halfway through, don't worry, there are timestamps waiting when you return. So take a breath, let the noise fade, and as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine swimming where no light reaches the bottom, and then, as the haze clears, a perfect circle of stones appears beneath you. 7 great pillars rise from the seafloor, arranged carefully in a ring, each one placed by human hands nearly 11,000 years ago. Around them, remnants of hearths, tools, and human bones lie silent, preserved by salt and silt. This is Atlit Yam, a village and ritual landscape swallowed by the Mediterranean between 9,000 and 8,500 years before the Common Era. The people who built it never meant for it to vanish. They simply lived beside the sea, until the sea came to live over them. Atlit Yam rests about 10 metres below the modern shoreline, near the town of Atlit in northern Israel. When it was inhabited, it stood on a coastal plain rich in freshwater springs and marshes, a place where the climate had just begun to stabilise after the long chaos of the Ice Age. Sea level was still 60 metres lower than today. Herds of gazelle and wild cattle roamed the nearby hills. Fish were abundant in the shallows, and humans had begun to settle more permanently, building stone dwellings beside wells and small garden plots. They were still pre-ceramic people. No pottery, no metal, no writing. But they were already shaping their surroundings with precision and memory. Archaeologists first discovered the site in the 1980s during underwater surveys led by Ehud Galili. What they uncovered would become one of the best preserved Neolithic settlements on Earth. Beneath layers of sand, divers found house foundations built from limestone blocks, rectangular rooms with stone floors, and a freshwater well more than 5 metres deep. Around it lay grinding stones, sickle blades, and piles of animal bone. Carbon dating placed the occupation between roughly 9,000 and 8,500 years before the present, at the very dawn of settled coastal life. And at the heart of it all stood the circle, 7 megaliths arranged in a semicircle around a central platform, each weighing up to 600 kilograms. Some were carved with shallow basins and grooves that could channel water. Nearby, archaeologists found clusters of fish bones and traces of hearths, suggesting communal feasts or ritual offerings. The entire structure was built adjacent to an ancient spring now submerged. Many researchers believe it served as a kind of water sanctuary, a place where early farmers and fishers honoured the life-giving element that sustained their community. What makes Atlit Yam extraordinary is its preservation. The rising Mediterranean drowned the site gradually, sealing it in anaerobic sediments that protected organic material rarely seen from this era. Wooden artefacts, basketry fragments, and even plant remains have survived. These finds tell us that the people who lived here cultivated lentils, chickpeas and flax alongside wild species. They kept cattle, hunted, fished and possibly wove nets from plant fibres. They were among the first to balance land and sea economies, combining agriculture with fishing in a sustainable rhythm that lasted centuries. But even more revealing are the human burials. Divers have recovered at least 10 skeletons from the site, including one of the earliest known cases of tuberculosis in a woman and child buried together near a dwelling. Their bones show care in placement and covering, suggesting formal funerary practice rather than casual disposal. Death here was not ignored. It was integrated into the fabric of life. The discovery of such burials beside the water hints at a symbolic relationship between the living, the dead, and the sea that would echo through later Mediterranean cultures. To understand Atlit Yam fully, we have to imagine the world in motion. Between 9,000 and 8,000 years before our time, the glaciers of the last ice age were still melting. The sea level rose roughly 1 metre every century, swallowing coastlines step by step. What is now the shallow bay of Atlit was once a fertile plain with freshwater springs. As the ocean advanced, these springs turned brackish, wells filled with salt water, and villages like this one had to move inland, or drown. The inhabitants likely watched the tides creep higher each year, perhaps noticing their ancestors' circle standing closer and closer to the waves, until one day it disappeared beneath the surface. That slow submergence makes Atlit Yam not a story of catastrophe, but of transition. The people here adapted for generations before finally abandoning the site. Some may have moved to higher ground, carrying their rituals with them. Others may have taken to boats, fishing and travelling along the Levantine coast. Evidence from stone anchors and net weights found nearby shows that they already understood navigation and marine resource management long before recorded seafaring began. In a way, these were the first coastal engineers, adjusting to climate change not through technology, but through migration and memory. Underwater archaeology at Atlit Yam is painstaking work. Divers map each stone by hand, photograph artifacts in situ, and use vacuum dredgers to remove sediment without disturbing fragile organic layers. The visibility is often low, currents shift the sand, saltwater corrodes everything metal, and yet, piece by piece, the picture emerges, a complete prehistoric community frozen in time. The combination of dwellings, ritual spaces and agricultural remains shows that the Neolithic revolution was not a single invention in one place. It was a mosaic of experiments unfolding across landscapes now lost beneath the sea. Chemical analysis of the site's sediments reveals microscopic diatoms and freshwater organisms, confirming that a spring once flowed directly through the stone circle. The basins carved into the megaliths may have collected or purified this water. Some archaeologists interpret this as a ceremonial fountain or healing sanctuary. Others propose a practical purpose, a system to channel and preserve fresh water in a changing coastal environment. The truth may lie between, ritual and utility intertwined, as so often in early human design. The human dimension of Atlit Yam goes beyond its stones. Dentalware studies and isotopic analysis of the skeletons show diets rich in both terrestrial and marine resources: goat, deer, fish, and shellfish. The inhabitants were healthy, long-lived for their era, and evidently skilled at balancing ecosystems. This was not a desperate community clinging to survival. It was a thriving, innovative one, experimenting with new ways of life on the edge of the rising sea. There is something deeply moving about how this village vanished, not through violence, but through the quiet persistence of nature. Every civilization faces the same truth eventually. Nothing we build stays above the tide forever. The people of Atlit Yam could not hold back the water, but they adapted until adaptation was no longer enough. Then they left, leaving behind their wells, their tools, and their circle of stones which the sea slowly embraced. Today, divers hovering over those megaliths see more than archaeology. They see the first warning written by the ocean itself, a reminder that the boundary between land and sea has never been fixed. For scientists studying modern climate change, Atlit Yam is a precious time capsule. It shows exactly how human societies respond to environmental transformation. First by innovation, then by ritual, and finally by movement. The record in its sediments mirrors our own challenges thousands of years later. But beyond all data, there is the human story. Imagine standing on that ancient shore as the waves advanced. Children playing where fields once lay, elders watching the horizon where their ancestors' monuments stood, and a community slowly understanding that the world itself was changing shape. Perhaps their last ceremony at the circle was a farewell, not to their gods, but to the land that had sustained them. When they walked away, they probably believed they were leaving memory behind. They could not know that salt and sediment would preserve their story longer than any stone temple on land. Today, the site is protected, surveyed through photogrammetry and sonar, its structures mapped in 3 dimensions. Each dive uncovers another detail: a flint blade still sharp, a hearth filled with ash, a pebble pendant smoothed by human touch. Every object tells us something simple and profound, that 11,000 years ago, people already understood community, cooperation and continuity. They just expressed them in ways that the sea would later hide. Atlit Yam reminds us that the earliest chapters of civilization are not always buried under earth. Some rest beneath waves. As ice sheets melted and coastlines shifted, countless other settlements like this one may now lie underwater waiting in silence. Every year, sonar surveys off the shores of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea and the Indian Ocean reveal new traces of submerged prehistory. Each one widens the map of where humanity once lived, showing that our ancestors were not bound to one landscape. They followed water, both its gifts and its dangers. If you could descend there now, past schools of fish and drifting algae, and touch one of those ancient stones, you would feel no difference between your hand and theirs. The sea that took their village still touches your world. The same currents that move above them tonight will, in time, move above us all. Imagine a vast green plain where today there is only sand. The wind moves through tall grass instead of dunes. Rain falls seasonally, filling shallow lakes that reflect a sky crowded with stars. Herds of long-horned cattle wander between acacia trees, followed by small groups of herders who drink from wells dug into the clay. It is 7,000 years before the Common Era, and southern Egypt, the region now called Nabta Playa, is not yet a desert. It is alive. And in the middle of this savanna, humans begin to move stones. They raise a circle aligned with the rising sun at the summer solstice, marking the longest day of the year. It may be the first calendar ever built, the earliest monument to the rhythm between earth and sky. When archaeologists first uncovered Nabta Playa in the late 20th century, they didn't expect to find anything monumental. The site lies deep in the Nubian desert, about 100 kilometres west of Abu Simbel, in what was once a seasonal lake basin. For much of the year it is desolate, sand, rock, and silence. But beneath that sand, evidence of an ancient world survived. Hearths, huts, stone-lined wells, animal bones, and most unexpectedly, a megalithic circle of standing stones. It was here that the earliest pastoralists, nomadic herders moving with the rains, built a monument that looked upward to the sun and outward to the horizon. The circle is small by later standards, roughly 4 meters across, but its meaning is immense. 6 upright stones form a pattern within an outer ring of larger slabs oriented to cardinal points. 2 pairs of inner stones align almost perfectly with the sunrise and sunset at the summer solstice, when the rains would have begun. The precision is astonishing given the tools available at the time. These builders had no compasses or written measurements. They observed, remembered, and marked what they saw across generations. Archaeologist Fred Wendorf and his team from Southern Methodist University, who led the first excavations in the 1970s and 90s, dated the site between 7,000 and 6,000 years before the Common Era. Radiocarbon analysis of charcoal and bones from nearby hearths confirmed that this circle predated the great civilizations of the Nile by thousands of years. It stood not as a temple, but as a statement, a human attempt to fix the movement of the sky into stone. Around the circle, researchers found other features: low stone mounds, carefully constructed tumuli, and rock-lined graves. Some contained the bones of domesticated cattle, buried deliberately and sometimes covered with slabs of sandstone. These were not refuse pits or food remains. They were ritual deposits. The people who lived here seemed to have revered cattle as symbols of power and survival. In a landscape where water dictated life, the cow was a living vessel, a walking link between earth and sustenance. Each burial tells a quiet story of ceremony. The skeletons are complete, sometimes positioned as if at rest, not dismembered or burned. Traces of ochre and stone beads suggest decoration. To bury livestock in this way meant sacrificing wealth and mobility, a profound gesture for nomads who depended on these animals for milk, blood, and status. Some archaeologists see this as the earliest form of cattle cult in Africa, possibly an ancestor of later pastoral traditions that spread across the continent. The environment around Nabta Playa was dynamic. climate records from lake sediments show that between roughly 9,000 and 6,000 years ago, the Sahara experienced a humid phase, the so-called African humid period. Monsoon rains pushed northward, creating grasslands and shallow lakes across what is now desert. Human groups followed these ecological corridors, moving with the rains, herding animals, and leaving behind hearths, tools, and stone structures. But the same data also shows cycles of drought. Around 6,000 years ago, rainfall declined sharply. The grasslands withered, lakes dried, and the people of Nabta Playa were forced to abandon their monuments as the desert advanced. That transformation makes the site both a scientific record and a warning. The stones still point to the solstice, but the world they marked no longer exists. The monument became a fossil of climate change, built during a green Sahara buried by its disappearance. To stand there today among cracked rocks and dust is to see time reversed. The builders lived in abundance, and what remains is scarcity. Beyond the famous stone circle, surveys have identified more than 200 additional megalithic features spread across the playa. These include alignments of upright slabs extending for hundreds of metres, small stone huts, hearths, and even clusters of elongated mounds thought to be ceremonial. Together they form one of the earliest planned ritual landscapes in the world. This was not random activity. It was a structured relationship between sky, land, and community. The astronomical precision of Nabta Playa is still debated. Some researchers argue that the alignments also mark bright stars such as Sirius or Orion's belt, visible on the horizon during the summer solstice around that period. If true, it would suggest a complex awareness of stellar cycles. Others caution that such patterns can appear coincidentally. What is certain is that the builders were observing the heavens systematically. They recognized the connection between celestial movement and seasonal change, the birth of what we might call science in its simplest, most human form: watching, remembering, predicting. Archaeobotanical remains from the site tell us these people collected wild sorghum, millet and tubers, but they were not yet full agriculturalists. They herded cattle and goats, fished in seasonal lakes, and lived in small mobile groups. The stone wells show engineering skill. Some reached more than 5 metres deep, lined with stones to prevent collapse. That level of planning reveals intimate knowledge of hydrology long before writing or metallurgy. They were adapting to an unpredictable climate through memory, not machines. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Nabta Playa is its symbolism. The combination of cattle burials, solar alignments, and circular architecture hints at a worldview that linked life, death, and cosmic order. When the sun reached its northernmost point, the rains came, the cattle grew strong, and the herders gathered. The circle may have served as a seasonal meeting place, where scattered groups reunited to exchange goods, rituals, and stories. In that sense, it was not just a calendar, it was a social anchor. As the climate dried and the lakes disappeared, these gatherings may have taken on a deeper meaning. Archaeologists have found evidence of repeated rebuilding and reorganization of the stone alignments, as if people were trying to preserve order while the world around them changed. When the desert finally consumed the basin, the site was left behind, its purpose fulfilled or impossible to continue. For thousands of years, wind and sand covered the stones until only the horizon remembered them. Today, Nabta Playa looks barren. The wind whistles over a flat, empty plain scattered with sandstone blocks. But if you kneel close to the circle, the geometry is still there. The same alignments that once greeted the sun. The precision of the stones remains perfect despite the passage of millennia. It is a silent reminder that intelligence did not begin with civilization. It began with observation, patience, and the courage to build meaning out of uncertainty. When modern archaeologists first realized the site's age, they faced a simple question. Why? Why would pastoral nomads invest time and effort in raising stones for something as abstract as the sky? The answer, perhaps, is that abstraction itself was becoming part of what it meant to be human. The people of Nabta Playa were not recording events, they were recording patterns. In doing so, they created the first dialogue between human intention and cosmic rhythm. If you could stand there at dawn 7,000 years ago, the light would rise over the eastern stones exactly as it does now, striking the inner circle and marking the moment when the rains would come. People would gather with their herds, singing, feasting, offering thanks. The horizon would shimmer with water and grass instead of heat, and as the first drops fell, they would know that the sun, the earth, and their own memory were in balance. Today, that balance has shifted again. The monsoon no longer reaches this far north, the grasslands have vanished, and the cattle cult has long since transformed into new traditions. Yet the stones endure. They wait under the same sky, pointing still to the place where the sun turns back toward winter. If you trace their line with your eyes, you follow the same geometry of time that guided the earliest herders across the Sahara. Perhaps that is the quiet miracle of Nabta Playa, a circle of stones in a vanished lake, built not to worship gods or kings, but to remember the sky itself. It is the humblest of monuments and the most enduring, and in that humility lies its power, a reminder that even in the simplest acts of observation, humanity began to build eternity. Imagine an island rising from the Mediterranean, ringed with cliffs and carved by wind that smells of salt and thyme. Now imagine people standing on that island more than 5,000 years ago, watching the first light of the summer solstice slide through a doorway of stone they built by hand. The beam travels down a long curved passage, spilling gold across a slab inside a temple. It happens only once a year, and when it does, the island glows as if the horizon itself is breathing. This is Mnajdra, paired with its sister site Ħaġar Qim, two of the oldest freestanding stone temples in the world, built long before metal, before writing, and before most of Europe even knew what a temple was. The Maltese archipelago sits in the centre of the Mediterranean Sea, a small bridge between Africa and Europe. In the 4th millennium before the Common Era, it was already inhabited by farming communities who had sailed there long before, navigating open water with nothing but stars, wind and memory. The people who landed on these islands brought livestock, seeds, and a sense of time measured not by kings or calendars, but by the turning of the sun. Out of soft golden limestone, they built something that would make that turning visible forever. The temples of Ħaġar Qim and Mnajdra are located on a southern terrace of Malta, facing the sea and the rising sun. They were built between 3,600 and 3,200 years before the Common Era, roughly the same period that the first great cities were forming in Mesopotamia. Yet here, far from rivers and empires, architecture took on a different role. These builders weren't erecting palaces or tombs, they were shaping a dialogue between light and stone. Ħaġar Qim sits slightly higher on the hill. Its name in Maltese means standing stones, and the complex is made of enormous limestone blocks, some weighing more than 20 tons. They were quarried nearby using stone and wooden tools, dragged on rollers, and set upright with astonishing precision. The walls curve gently, forming a series of apses, oval chambers radiating from a central corridor. It is not geometry for its own sake. It feels organic, almost anatomical, like the interior of a living being. Archaeologists often describe these structures as feminine in form, womb-like, protective and filled with circular motifs. At the heart of Ħaġar Qim lies an altar aligned toward the southeast, where the sun rises at the summer solstice. At dawn on that day, the sunlight passes through a small hole cut in one of the stones, what modern researchers call an oracle hole, and projects an oval disk of light onto the opposite wall. As the minutes pass, that light shifts and elongates, tracing the slow rotation of the Earth itself. Thousands of years before the invention of mechanical clocks, these people captured time with sunlight and stone. Below Ħaġar Qim, close to the edge of the sea, stands Mnajdra. It is smaller but even more precise. The complex consists of 3 interconnected temples, each with doorways perfectly aligned to solar events. During the equinoxes, light penetrates the central doorway and illuminates the inner altar. At the solstices, it strikes the corners instead. The builders carve small spiral motifs and dotted patterns on the stone near these entrances, perhaps marking the passage of days or the rhythm of seasons. To stand inside during the solstice is to watch a sunrise 5,000 years old replay itself, exactly as they intended. The precision of these alignments has been confirmed by modern surveys and astronomical modelling. The builders understood not just the rising and setting of the sun, but its gradual shift across the horizon over the course of the year. They built architecture that anticipated those changes, a living calendar carved from limestone. To call this astronomy might be misleading. It was not science in our modern sense, but a spiritual geometry, born from observation and reverence. They were measuring not distance, but belonging. Archaeologists have found altars, carved figurines, and offering holes within the temples. Many of these figurines are stylized human forms, often with broad hips and abstract faces. Some may represent fertility, others perhaps deities or ancestors. One famous sculpture discovered within Ħaġar Qim shows a reclining figure with delicate folds of flesh, carved from soft limestone. It radiates calmness rather than authority. There are no weapons, no depictions of rulers or conquest. The imagery of Malta's temple culture is domestic, organic, cyclical. It reflects a worldview in which time and creation are endless loops, not linear paths. The spiral carvings that decorate many of the walls reinforce this idea. Some are simple twin spirals, others complex labyrinthine patterns. To the modern eye they may appear decorative, but their placement, often near thresholds and altars, suggests symbolism. Spirals could represent life cycles, the sun's motion or water, which was precious on this island. They turn endlessly inward and outward, like the orbit of the stars these builders watched each night. What's remarkable is how isolated yet advanced this culture became. Malta lies more than 80 kilometres from the nearest mainland, meaning that contact with neighbouring peoples was rare. The islanders developed their own architectural tradition, building more than 30 known temple sites across the archipelago. Each shares the same basic blueprint, curving apses, altars and solar alignments, but each is unique in detail. This suggests a shared spiritual system but localized expression, much like different monasteries following one faith, but adapting to their landscape. The question of how these early builders arrived on Malta at all remains open. The sea between Sicily and Malta was already open water by this period. To reach the island, people must have used sturdy boats, possibly made of reeds or wooden planks sealed with animal fat or resin. They carried animals and heavy stones, which implies repeated voyages. In that sense, the temples of Mnajdra and Ħaġar Qim are not only monuments to light, but proof of early navigation, evidence that prehistoric people could cross seas with intention, guided by stars and the memory of horizons. When excavations began in the 19th and 20th centuries, the scale of these structures astonished scholars. Many believed at first that they must be much younger, perhaps Phoenician or Mycenaean. Only radiocarbon dating and comparison with earlier Neolithic settlements revealed their true antiquity. They were built long before classical civilization, before the pyramids, before even the great ziggurats of Mesopotamia. The realization forced archaeology to reconsider what isolated island cultures could achieve. One intriguing detail found in both temples is the presence of small round stones, spherical objects that may have served as primitive bearings. Some researchers think they were used to roll the massive blocks into place, functioning as early engineering aids. Others see them as symbolic, perhaps representing the sun itself. Either way, they speak to ingenuity far beyond what was once imagined for this period. There are traces, too, of paint and plaster on some interior walls, suggesting that the temples were once coloured. Imagine entering Mnajdra not as the bare ruin we see today, but as a glowing space filled with red, white and ochre pigments reflecting the light of dawn. The carvings would shimmer, the air would smell of burning herbs and sea wind, and the low hum of chanting might echo through the apses. Ritual here was not about grandeur. It was about synchronization between people, stone, and sun. By around 2,500 years before the Common Era, this temple-building culture ended. The reasons remain unclear. Some scholars suggest environmental stress, deforestation, soil depletion, or drought. Others see social change, perhaps a shift towards smaller communities or new belief systems. Whatever the cause, the people stopped building, and the temples fell silent. They were later covered by soil and forgotten until rediscovered thousands of years later. Today, visitors walking among the ruins see only fragments of what once was. The stones still catch the light in June and December, their ancient purpose intact despite millennia of erosion. The surrounding sea still glows with the same deep blue, the same currents that carried the builders to these shores. Every sunrise that passes through those doorways continues their experiment in permanence, a way to trap time in stone and make meaning survive isolation. Standing inside Mnajdra during solstice, the beam of light slides across the altar as it has for 5,000 years. For a moment everything aligns, the sea, the sky, the memory of the builders. You can almost sense their intention, to prove that even on a small island surrounded by endless water, the human spirit could still touch the cosmos. They didn't need empires or writing to reach the stars. They needed patience, cooperation, and trust in the sun's return. Perhaps that's what the spiral meant all along. Not just a symbol of life, but a quiet understanding that everything comes back. The seasons, the light, the stories, even us. Imagine walking across a misty plain in ancient Brittany, long before the word France existed. The air is damp, the ground soft with dew, and ahead of you stretch endless rows of standing stones, hundreds, then thousands of them, each one placed by human hands. They rise from the earth like a frozen tide, arranged with unnerving precision across the rolling landscape. No walls, no roofs, no temples, just lines of granite stretching toward the horizon. The question is immediate and quiet. Who did this, and what were they trying to say to the land itself? These are the Carnac Alignments, located near the modern coastal town of Carnac in northwestern France. Dating from roughly 4,500 to 3,300 years before the Common Era, they represent one of the largest and most mysterious megalithic landscapes on Earth. More than 3,000 stones, some towering over 4 meters high, were arranged in long parallel rows extending for several kilometers. Each one had to be quarried, transported, and set upright with care, long before metal tools or wheels reached Europe. The effort would have required generations of coordination, a society not just of builders, but of organisers, planners, and rememberers. Archaeologists have debated the function of these alignments for centuries. They are too ordered to be random, yet too vast to have a single purpose. Early researchers imagined battle memorials, calendars, or giant cemeteries. Modern science, however, paints a subtler picture. The alignments likely formed a ceremonial landscape, a processional path through which sound, movement, and memory intertwined. The people of Neolithic Brittany seem to have turned the act of walking itself into a ritual, a choreography of stone, sound, and space that bound communities together. Each alignment begins with larger stones, called menhirs, and tapers towards smaller ones, creating a visual rhythm across the fields. The largest cluster, at Menek, includes 11 rows stretching nearly a kilometre. Others, at Kermario and Kerleskan, form parallel sequences extending even farther, with smaller satellite alignments scattered across the region. When viewed from above, the arrangement appears almost musical, repeating patterns, pauses, and crescendos rendered in granite. Some archaeologists describe the entire complex as a stone symphony, built to guide movement and perception rather than mark territory. Excavations around the base of the stones have revealed post holes, hearths, and small pits containing charcoal, flint tools, and pottery fragments. These traces suggest that gatherings or ceremonies took place among the alignments. Some stones show signs of burning at their bases, possibly from torches or controlled fires used during rituals, yet no burials have been found directly within the rows, and no single structure indicates a central temple. Instead, the sacredness seems to have been distributed evenly across the landscape, woven into the act of alignment itself. The stones themselves were quarried from nearby granite outcrops and transported, in some cases, several kilometres. Experimental archaeology has shown that small teams using wooden sledges, ropes and rollers could move these multi-ton blocks across open terrain, especially with water or clay to reduce friction. Setting them upright would have required ramps, levers, and a deep understanding of balance. Multiply that by thousands of stones, and you begin to glimpse the scale of coordination, a collective effort that may have united communities across entire regions of prehistoric Brittany. Geophysical surveys in recent decades have revealed that the stones were not placed arbitrarily. Magnetic and ground-penetrating radar data show that many alignments follow subtle changes in topography, guiding movement toward higher ground or natural landmarks. Some rows converge on circular enclosures or open clearings, suggesting staging areas for gatherings. Others seem to frame views of the distant hills or the nearby Atlantic shore. The pattern implies spatial intelligence. The builders use the land itself as part of the monument, transforming geography into ceremony. The social structure behind Carnac must have been complex enough to sustain long-term planning without centralised authority. There are no signs of hierarchy, no palaces, no fortifications, no elite graves. Instead, what emerges is a picture of cooperative labour on a monumental scale, possibly organised through seasonal gatherings. People may have met during certain times of year, when food was abundant and weather stable, to raise new stones or maintain the existing ones. These events could have reinforced social bonds, shared identity, and collective memory. One of the most intriguing lines of research in recent years concerns the acoustics of the site. The alignment of tall, narrow stones across open plains creates corridors where sound behaves unusually. Experiments using drums and voices have shown that certain frequencies resonate between the stones, producing echo patterns that can carry long distances. It is possible that processions accompanied by chanting or percussion would have created shifting waves of sound, interacting with the rows like an early form of environmental music. The builders may not have understood acoustic physics, but they certainly understood experience. The alignments might have been designed to make the human voice itself part of the landscape. At Menek, the best preserved alignment, the rows culminate in a curved enclosure that could have functioned as a gathering point or amphitheatre. From there, one could look back across hundreds of stones and watch them recede into perspective, the lines merging toward the horizon. It is a view that invites motion, not stasis, a path, rather than a monument. Walking through Carnac even today feels disorienting. The repetition of shapes tricks the eye, distances blur, and the mind slips into a meditative rhythm. It is easy to imagine ancient processions moving through the lines, following sound, light and memory into a trance of meaning. Carbon dating from nearby hearths and tool fragments confirms that the alignments were built over centuries, possibly evolving through different phases of construction. Some stones were added or repositioned, others toppled and re-erected. This suggests a living site, not a single event. A monument constantly renewed, perhaps as part of cyclical ritual traditions. The builders were not aiming for permanence so much as continuity. Each generation added its stones, maintaining the pattern even as its purpose shifted slightly with time. The sheer quantity of labour invested here challenges modern assumptions about prehistoric societies. To quarry and erect thousands of stones required immense cooperation, logistics, and communication. Yet all evidence points to communities without written language or centralised control. What held them together was not force, but belief. A shared understanding that these alignments mattered, that they embodied something larger than individual life. The meaning may have been lost to us, but the pattern remains, etched into the French countryside like a long-forgotten equation of human devotion. In recent years, archaeologists using drone imaging and LIDAR have discovered that the alignments extend even farther than previously mapped. Some continue beneath fields, roads, and modern villages. The total number of stones may once have exceeded 10,000. This discovery reinforces the idea that Carnac was not a single site, but an interconnected network, a landscape-scale expression of unity. The entire region was a canvas for symbolic architecture. When you stand there today, in the quiet light of early morning, the stones cast long shadows across the grass. They are rough to the touch, weathered but unbroken. Each one leans slightly, as if in conversation with its neighbour. Birds nest in their crevices, and the wind hums softly through the gaps. The sense of continuity is overwhelming. What you see is not a ruin, but a surviving rhythm. It is tempting to interpret the alignments through our own frameworks, religion, art, science, but perhaps they were all of these at once. They may have functioned as pathways of initiation, as sonic chambers, or simply as places where people could gather and remember that they belonged to something vast and shared. Whatever their original purpose, they capture a truth about humanity that still holds. We organise the world to make it sing back to us. The Carnac Alignments endure because they are more than architecture. They are intention solidified. Each stone holds a fraction of human will, multiplied thousands of times across a landscape. That will is the same one that still drives us to build, to connect, to seek order in the unknown. When we look at them now, we're seeing ourselves reflected, not as individuals, but as a collective force of creation. Imagine standing in darkness so complete that you can hear your own breath echo off the stones. Then, just as the horizon begins to pale, a narrow beam of golden light slides through a slit above the doorway and creeps across the floor, inch by inch, until it touches the farthest wall of the chamber. For 17 minutes the tomb glows from within as if the earth itself were exhaling light, and then the beam fades, and the darkness returns for another year. This is not a myth or poetic exaggeration. It is a real event that still happens every winter solstice inside Newgrange, a monument built more than 5,000 years ago on a ridge above the Boyne River in Ireland. The people who engineered it were Neolithic farmers and builders, yet they captured the movement of the sun with a precision that rivals the observatories of much later ages. Newgrange was built around 3,200 years before the Common Era, making it older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt and the cities of Mesopotamia. It belongs to the same culture that shaped the wider Boyne Valley complex, an interconnected landscape of ritual and burial sites that once served as both calendar and sanctuary. From above, the monument looks like a great white mound encircled by stone curbs, its surface gleaming with white quartz and river cobbles. From within, it is a masterpiece of engineering, a dry stone passage leading to a corbelled chamber that has stood untouched by collapse for over 5 millennia. The mound itself is immense, 80 metres across and 12 metres high, containing more than 200,000 tons of stone. Every block was quarried, shaped, and carried by hand from kilometres away. The builders layered these stones carefully, creating an inward-leaning structure that distributes its weight perfectly, allowing the passage and chamber to remain stable without mortar. It is one of the earliest known uses of corbelling, a technique that would later define monumental architecture across Europe and Asia. The precision is astonishing. Modern surveys have found that the passage's tilt and height are perfectly calculated to allow a single shaft of sunlight to penetrate to the back wall only at sunrise on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. The entrance itself is an artwork of cosmic geometry. A massive entrance stone lies just outside, carved with spirals, lozenges and serpentine patterns. These motifs appear across the Boyne Valley, but here they achieve an almost hypnotic refinement. The triple spiral, a continuous line looping inward and outward without end, may represent the sun, the cycle of seasons, or the eternal return of life from darkness. Above the doorway sits a small opening known as the roof box, a rectangular aperture carefully angled to admit sunlight only when the sun rises at its lowest point in the sky. This was no accident. Aligning such an aperture without the aid of modern instruments required generations of observation, testing and shared memory. Inside, the passage stretches 19 metres into the mound before opening into a cruciform chamber. 3 smaller recesses branch from the centre, each containing a massive stone basin. Some of these basins still bear traces of cremated bone and burnt offerings. The walls are decorated with incised carvings, spirals, chevrons, arcs, patterns that seem to move when illuminated by torchlight. At the very top of the central chamber, the corbelled ceiling rises in a series of overlapping layers, converging into a single capstone nearly 6 metres above the floor. When the solstice light enters, it strikes this upper space first, then spreads downward, turning the entire interior into a chamber of living light. For the Neolithic people who built Newgrange, the winter solstice was not just an astronomical event, it was a spiritual rebirth. The days leading up to it would have been marked by growing cold and darkness, the fading of crops, the death of light. When the sun's first rays pierced the tomb, it would have signalled the turning of the year, the promise that warmth and fertility would return. The dead, entombed in the chamber, would have shared in that renewal, illuminated by the same sun that fed the living. In that moment, death and life, sky and earth, time and eternity converged. Archaeological evidence suggests that Newgrange functioned both as a tomb and as a ceremonial centre. Excavations have revealed cremated remains of at least 5 individuals, along with offerings of bone pins, beads and polished stone pendants. Yet the scale and engineering far exceed what would be required for a burial site. The effort involved implies communal labour on a massive scale. Supported by surplus agriculture and sophisticated social organisation, estimates suggest it could have taken hundreds of workers several decades to complete. To coordinate such a project, the builders must have possessed not only technical skill but also shared belief, a cosmology that bound them to the cycles of the sun. The quartz facade that once covered the mound's exterior glowed in daylight, creating a striking contrast against the darker stones of the structure behind it. Under certain light, it would have sparkled like ice. Some researchers believe this was intentional, a way of connecting the monument to both the brilliance of the sun and the coldness of winter. The facade may have acted as a symbolic boundary, separating the world of the living from that of the ancestors within. In this sense, Newgrange is less a tomb than a threshold, a point of exchange between worlds. Within the broader Boyne Valley, similar passage tombs, Nothendooth among them, echo the same architectural vocabulary. Each seems to participate in a network of alignments and sightlines, mapping the path of the sun across the year. But Newgrange stands out for the elegance of its engineering and the enduring clarity of its purpose. Even today, computer models and field measurements confirm that the solstice alignment remains exact despite millennia of shifting terrain. The sun still finds its way into the heart of the monument, as if guided by the same hands that first designed it. The carvings throughout the site remain enigmatic. Spirals, concentric circles, and zigzag lines cover many stones, arranged without obvious narrative but with rhythmic repetition. Some scholars suggest they represent solar movement, lunar cycles, or even trance imagery, visual echoes of states of altered consciousness achieved during ritual. Others see them as purely aesthetic, expressions of a symbolic language now lost. Whatever their meaning, they testify to an artistic sensibility deeply tied to observation and pattern. The builders were not primitive stonemasons, they were geometers and storytellers working in limestone and light. Excavations in the 20th century also revealed intriguing details about construction techniques. The inner passage was sealed during the building process, layer by layer, indicating careful staging. Some of the stone used in the tomb was transported from sources more than 70 kilometres away, including granite boulders and Göbekli cobbles. Transporting these without wheels or draft animals would have required ingenuity, probably rafts along rivers, rollers overland, and large coordinated teams. It's not hard to imagine the movement of such stones itself becoming ritual, an act of devotion repeated year after year. If you visit Newgrange today and enter the passage, you will notice something else. The acoustics. The corbelled ceiling and curved stone surfaces create a resonance that amplifies low tones and hums. When the solstice light enters, the chamber doesn't just glow, it seems to vibrate. Some archaeologists and acoustic researchers have proposed that sound played a role in the rituals performed here, perhaps chanting or drumming to accompany the arrival of the sun. The design, whether intentional or not, creates an immersive experience that bridges sensory boundaries. Sight, sound, and touch, all converging in one moment of transformation. Newgrange is, above all, an act of optimism carved into stone. It is a declaration that light will always return. For a farming people living at the mercy of seasons, that belief was survival itself. But it's also something more enduring. A recognition of cosmic order and human connection to it. They didn't build merely to survive the winter. They built to celebrate their place in a universe of cycles. When we look at it now, we can measure its angles, analyse its sediment layers, date its charcoal fragments. But standing inside during solstice light reminds us that these builders didn't think in data. They thought in feeling. The precision of the alignment was their form of faith, a way to anchor emotion in geometry. The beam of sunlight entering the tomb wasn't just a calendar marker. It was a reassurance that darkness has an end. Outside, the landscape of the Boyne Valley still folds around the mound like a slow green tide. The river glints in the distance, winding as it did thousands of years ago. On mornings in late December, when the sun rises low over the hills, the first light still strikes the roof box. For a few minutes, the chamber within awakens. No matter who stands there to witness it, scientist, tourist, or descendant, the same thought occurs, that we are watching the oldest sunrise still scheduled by human hands. Imagine a storm tearing across the edge of the world. Wind howls off the Atlantic, waves crash against cliffs, and beneath layers of sand and grass, something ancient begins to reappear. When the storm clears, the villagers of Orkney in northern Scotland discover walls, hearths and passageways, houses built of stone perfectly preserved beneath the dunes. What they've uncovered is not just a ruin, but a frozen moment in time. It is Skara Brae, the most complete Neolithic village ever found in Europe. A place where 5,000 years ago, ordinary life was already extraordinary. Where cooking, art, and ritual were part of the same architecture. Skara Brae dates to around 3,200 years before the Common Era, built by farming communities on the Orkney Islands, a small archipelago perched between the North Sea and the Atlantic. At that time, the islands were warmer than today, covered in grasslands and small patches of woodland. The people who lived there grew barley, herded cattle and sheep, and fished the surrounding waters. They were among the northernmost farmers on Earth, living on the edge of the habitable world, and yet they built with precision and comfort that would surprise even a Roman. The village consists of 8 interconnected houses linked by narrow covered passages. Each dwelling has a central stone hearth, built-in cupboards, beds formed from slabs of rock, and even rudimentary plumbing. Drainage channels lined with stone that may have carried wastewater away. The walls were insulated with turf, and roofs likely made from driftwood and thatch. In the dim light of oil lamps, these interiors would have felt warm, ordered, and human. For centuries, families lived here side by side, sharing tools, food, and stories as the North Atlantic roared outside. But Skara Brae was more than a village. Its architecture blurs the line between domestic and sacred. Every house follows the same layout, as if designed according to a shared cosmology. A central hearth, symbolising the sun or life force, flanked by 2 stone beds, and opposite the entrance, a dresser or altar-like platform where objects were displayed. Some of these objects, beads, figurines, carved bone pins, appear to have been placed deliberately as offerings or symbols. To enter a home was to step into a miniature universe, where everyday life mirrored the structure of belief. Archaeologists have found evidence of ritual continuity, linking Skara Brae with larger ceremonial sites nearby. Maisho, the stones of Stennis, and the Great Ring of Brodgar. Together, these monuments form what is now called the heart of Neolithic Orkney, a complex of domestic and ritual architecture, unlike anything else in prehistoric Europe. Maisho, a massive circular mound about 10 kilometres away, is a passage tomb aligned precisely with the setting sun at the winter solstice. When the light enters its stone corridor each December, it illuminates the inner chamber, just as at Newgrange in Ireland, though separated by sea and distance. The Ring of Brodgar, meanwhile, is a vast circle of standing stones, set within a natural amphitheatre of hills and lochs. It may have served as a gathering place for ceremonies connecting the living, the dead, and the cycles of the sky. The remarkable thing is how close these sites are to each other. You can walk between them across open fields in a few hours. This proximity suggests not isolated communities, but an integrated ritual landscape. The people who built Skara Brae were also the ones who built the tombs and circles. They didn't divide religion from daily life. They lived inside their cosmology. Every hearth was an echo of the great fires lit at Brodgar, every meal a quiet ritual of renewal. Excavations at Skara Brae reveal details of daily existence that feel startlingly intimate. The villagers ate a diet rich in seafood, beef, mutton and barley. Shell middens show they collected limpets and whelks, while animal bones indicate communal feasting. They made tools from bone, antler and polished stone, crafted jewellery and shaped small clay figurines, perhaps idols or charms. One house seems to have been used differently from the rest, lacking beds and containing unusual objects. It may have served as a communal workshop or ceremonial space. What stands out most is the uniformity of wealth. No house is larger or grander than another. Skara Brae was a society of relative equality, built on cooperation rather than hierarchy. Artifacts found at the site hint at creativity and identity. Carved geometric patterns, chevrons, spirals and intersecting lines decorate some stone slabs and pottery fragments. These designs mirror motifs found at Maishu and other Orcadian sites, suggesting a shared symbolic language. Perhaps these markings represented elements of nature, celestial cycles, or the boundaries between worlds. They appear almost mathematical, yet their purpose was likely emotional, a way to inscribe belonging into the fabric of stone. One of the most evocative discoveries is a collection of small beads made from whalebone, found near the hearth of one dwelling. The sea was never far from these people's imagination. The ocean was both a barrier and a bridge, a force of destruction and sustenance. Driftwood, whales and seals provided material and myth alike. The constant presence of waves and wind must have shaped their worldview. A life defined by rhythm and resilience. Yet, for all its ingenuity, the community of Skara Brae was not eternal. Around 2,500 years before the Common Era, climate change began to alter the islands. Pollen analysis and soil cores show a shift toward colder, wetter conditions. The same storms that preserved the village may have first driven its people away. Coastal erosion intensified, fields turned to bog, and food production declined. Eventually the inhabitants abandoned their homes, sealing the doors with slabs of stone, as if preparing them for future discovery. When the site was excavated in the 20th century, archaeologists were astonished at how complete it was. Furniture remained in place, even fragments of pottery and tools lay where they had been dropped. It was as if the people had simply walked out one day and never returned. But perhaps that's fitting. Skara Brae was always a conversation with time, a settlement built to outlast its makers. Its survival beneath sand and grass feels almost intentional, as though the builders understood that impermanence was part of the story. The larger Orkney complex deepens this sense of continuity. May Show's passage, with its winter solstice alignment, shows that these islanders tracked the sun with the same precision as their counterparts far to the south. The Ring of Brodgar, composed of stones transported from different parts of the islands, may have functioned as a unifying circle, a place where scattered communities gathered for seasonal rites, feasting or decision-making. The scale of labour involved is staggering for such a small population, yet it fits a pattern visible across prehistory. When times grew uncertain, people built monuments not to dominate nature, but to understand it. Archaeological analysis of human remains from Orkney supports this view. The bones show signs of good health and strong physiques, indicating a well-nourished population. There is little evidence of violence or inequality. This was a society that invested energy in cooperation and shared meaning. The monuments were not displays of power, they were acts of connection to the sky, the sea, and one another. One of the most fascinating discoveries came from Michaux itself. When Norse explorers entered the mound thousands of years later, they carved runic graffiti on its walls. Some inscriptions simply named travellers, others described treasure or women admired. But the act of carving into that ancient stone shows something remarkable: the continuity of wonder. Even across ages and cultures, the chamber's power to inspire awe remained unchanged. Today, Orkney feels much the same as it likely did then, a meeting place between earth and ocean, where the wind carries voices older than writing. Standing inside one of the houses of Skara Brae, you can still see the hearth, the stone bed, and the view toward the sea. It feels lived in, not dead. At Michaux, during the solstice, light still streams down the passage, golden against grey stone, and at Brodgar the stones still stand in quiet arcs, reflected in the locks on either side. These are not ruins. They are instruments still tuned to the rhythm of the world. What makes Orkney unique is the intimacy of its scale. Unlike the towering pyramids or sprawling cities of other ancient cultures, these monuments invite closeness. They remind us that civilization began not with conquest, but with care, with communities who found sacredness in daily life and permanence in cooperation. Their architecture wasn't meant to impress strangers. It was meant to guide the seasons, to comfort the living, to honour the dead, and to remember that life itself was a ritual worth preserving. If you stand at Skara Brae at sunset, the wind howling through the stone alleys, it's easy to imagine smoke rising from the hearths, laughter carried over the dunes, and voices reciting the same stories that once defined them. They lived knowing that light would fade and storms would come, yet they built anyway, beautifully, precisely, with meaning carved into every wall. Imagine the sound of wood and rope, the grunt of human effort and the hollow thud of stone meeting earth. Thousands of people gathered on a plain, the horizon wide and silent, lifting a ring of stones so massive that they would outlast their names, their language, even their world. In the chill of dawn, the first lintel locked into place, 2 upright pillars crowned by a capstone weighing as much as 4 elephants. The circle was complete. The people stepped back, and for a brief moment the rising sun passed through its axis perfectly. That instant of alignment would be repeated every year for millennia. They had built something that measured the sky itself. Stonehenge, in southern Britain, remains the most studied, contested, and reimagined of all prehistoric monuments. Yet beneath centuries of myth and speculation lies a simple truth. It was a structure born from precision, cooperation, and an evolving relationship between life, death, and sound. It began humbly around 3,000 years before the Common Era, as a circular earthwork with timber posts and shallow ditches, and by 2,000 years before the Common Era, it had transformed into a ring of standing stones unlike anything else in the prehistoric world. The site evolved through at least 3 major phases. The first was the earliest earthwork enclosure, marked by a circular ditch and bank over 100 metres wide with a ring of 56 post holes known as the Avebury holes. Within these holes, archaeologists have found cremated human remains, the earliest large-scale evidence of cremation in Britain. It appears that the very first version of Stonehenge was not a temple for the living, but a resting place for the dead. The people who gathered here were uniting memory with landscape, marking a space where ancestors and sky could meet. Centuries later, the second great transformation began. From the distant Priestley Hills in western Wales, more than 200 kilometres away, builders transported dozens of smaller stones, known today as the Blue Stones. Some weighed as much as 4 tons each. They were dragged across rough terrain, loaded onto rafts and floated down rivers before being hauled again overland to the Salisbury Plain. It remains one of the most remarkable feats of prehistoric transport. These blue stones were not chosen at random. They contain minerals that ring when struck, producing clear bell-like tones. For the builders, that may have mattered as much as their colour or shape. Stonehenge was not just visual, it was acoustic. The third phase saw the arrival of the iconic sarsen stones, towering slabs of local sandstone weighing up to 30 tons apiece. These were arranged in a double circle and topped with horizontal lintels locked into place with carved joints, an extraordinary engineering innovation for the time. When completed, the outer ring stood as a colonnade of stone windows framing the sky. Inside, a horseshoe of taller trilithons, the famous paired uprights and capstones, focused attention on the rising sun at the summer solstice and the setting sun at the winter solstice. The monument had become both a calendar and a cathedral of light. Archaeological excavation and radiocarbon dating show that Stonehenge was built over more than 1,000 years, modified repeatedly by different generations. It was not one project, but a tradition, a living monument continually renewed by new hands. During this time, Britain's population was shifting dramatically. Genetic studies reveal that around 2,500 years before the Common Era, a new wave of people from continental Europe arrived, bringing new pottery styles, animal domestication, and burial customs. Yet the monument continued to hold meaning for both the old and new. It bridged lineages, merging identities through shared ritual. Evidence from isotopic analysis of bones and teeth found nearby tells us that people came from far and wide to participate in ceremonies at the site. Some had travelled from as far as the Scottish Highlands and even continental Europe. Cattle bones found in nearby feasting areas carry isotopic signatures from different regions, suggesting seasonal gatherings where hundreds or even thousands of people met, bringing food, tools and offerings. These were not the isolated druids of legend, but communities uniting under a common sky. The bluestone's acoustic properties add a haunting dimension to these gatherings. Studies conducted on surviving fragments show that when struck, the stones emit clear, resonant tones that could have been used rhythmically or musically. Within the circular enclosure, the sound would have reverberated and echoed, amplified by the spacing of the stones. Some researchers have even proposed that the layout of the circle mimics sound interference patterns, the physical geometry of vibration. Whether intentional or not, the experience of standing among the stones while drums or chants filled the air must have been overwhelming. Stonehenge was not silent. It was an instrument that played the air itself. Excavations have revealed evidence of both life and death around the monument. The cremation burials in the Aubrey holes appear to have continued for generations, while post holes and hearths nearby indicate temporary dwellings and large feasts. To those who built it, the circle may have represented the union of both worlds, the eternal cycles of the heavens mirrored in the renewal of human life. The solstice alignments reinforced that message. Each summer, the sun rose through the heel stone, casting its light down the central avenue and into the heart of the monument. Each winter, it set between the tallest trilithons, marking death, rest, and the promise of return. Engineering studies of the site show how extraordinary this precision was. The stones were shaped using hammerstones of harder rock, their surfaces smoothed, and their joints carefully carved to fit together like wooden beams. Holes were dug with antler picks, and ramps of chalk and timber were used to raise the uprights. The lintels were placed on top using complex lever systems, their mortise and tenon joints ensuring stability. To lift even one sarsen required dozens of people working in unison, guided by rhythm and coordination, perhaps the same rhythm that echoed through the stones during ceremony. The geology of the sarsens tells another story. Chemical analysis shows that most were sourced from a single region about 20 kilometres north of the site, meaning the builders deliberately selected material from one consistent outcrop. This uniformity created harmony in colour and sound, giving the monument its coherent visual identity. Each choice, from transport routes to stone texture, was deliberate. The builders understood that meaning required order. For centuries, the monument functioned as both observatory and gathering ground. Archaeological pollen samples show periodic burning and replanting of the surrounding landscape, suggesting managed clearings that framed the horizon lines for observation. The open plains around Stonehenge were not wilderness. They were designed. Pathways, timber circles, and processional routes connected different parts of the ritual complex. People arrived not by accident but through choreography. The social significance of this cannot be overstated. In a world without cities or written law, monuments like Stonehenge were the binding agents of society. They gave scattered groups a shared calendar, a common ritual, and a place to remember their dead. The act of gathering itself was the culture. Each alignment, each echo, each rising sun reaffirmed belonging. Even today, standing within the ring, you feel its architecture work upon your senses. The towering stones enclose space not just visually, but acoustically. Your voice softens, the wind quiets, and footsteps seem to fade. The geometry absorbs sound and light alike, creating stillness. To a Neolithic observer, that stillness may have felt sacred, a silence that spoke. Over time, the world around Stonehenge changed. By 2,000 years before the Common Era, its rituals evolved. New burial practices and metal tools appeared across Britain, yet the monument remained a focal point. People continued to visit, to bury their dead, to mark the sun's passage. Even as belief systems shifted, the architecture still commanded reverence. The stones had become more than a monument. They had become memory incarnate. What survives today is both less and more than what once stood. Many stones have fallen or vanished, their lintels broken, their alignments are complete. But the logic of the design still lives in the earth itself, in the chalk rings and buried sockets that outline a cosmic plan older than any nation. Modern laser surveys have mapped every carving and groove, revealing axe motifs and engravings that link the monument to later Bronze Age symbolism. Even after its original purpose faded, the circle remained a canvas for generations to inscribe their stories upon. To look at Stonehenge through the eyes of its builders is to see an intersection of engineering, ritual and empathy. They worked not for profit or glory, but to bind their community to time itself. Every solstice, when the light slides perfectly between the stones, we glimpse their success. The monument still works. It still captures the sun, still channels sound, still stirs the human sense of awe. In the end, Stonehenge is not a mystery to be solved, but an experience to be felt. A conversation between people and planet that never truly ended. It reminds us that even 5,000 years ago, humans were already scientists, architects and musicians, shaping matter to mirror meaning. The circle endures because it was built on something timeless, the need to understand where we stand in the turning of the world. Imagine standing in the middle of a landscape that feels alive, as if the hills themselves had been shaped by human hands. The wind moves across wide chalk plains, carrying the sound of crows and the rustle of grass. In every direction rise signs of deliberate design, enormous banks of earth, rings of standing stones, and at the centre of it all, a perfect artificial hill so symmetrical that it looks impossible to have been made with bone tools and woven baskets. This is Avebury and Silbury Hill, a monumental complex in southern Britain that turns the land itself into architecture. It was built nearly 5,000 years ago, between 2,600 and 2,400 years before the Common Era, when early farming communities decided that sacredness was not something to build on the ground, but something to carve into it. Avebury is the largest stone circle in the world. Its ditch and bank enclosure stretches over 400 metres across, enclosing an area large enough to hold an entire village. Within that circular boundary once stood 100 giant sarsen stones, many weighing up to 40 tons each, forming a ring that encased two smaller stone circles inside. Unlike later monuments that stand isolated, Avebury integrates the natural world into its design. Its circular ditches mirror the surrounding hills, and its openings align not to the sun or moon, but to the cardinal directions of the horizon. It is both enclosure and gateway, a place where the earth itself becomes a stage for ritual movement. To build such a structure required not just labour, but vision. The ditch alone is extraordinary. Originally more than 9 metres deep and 20 wide, carved entirely into the chalk bedrock using antler picks and stone tools. Archaeologists estimate that over 100,000 cubic metres of chalk were removed and piled outward to form the surrounding bank. Thousands of people must have participated in the excavation, their work synchronised over weeks or even months, following a shared plan that had to exist first in imagination before it could exist in the landscape. Inside the vast circle, the two inner rings each had their own arrangements of stones and pathways, suggesting a hierarchy of spaces, places for gathering, for ritual, perhaps even for processions that connected the circles to the larger avenues extending outward into the countryside. Those avenues, called the West Kennet and Beckhampton avenues, were lined with paired standing stones, forming processional corridors that stretched for several kilometres. Walking down one of these stone roads would have felt like entering another realm, guided by rows of silent sentinels leading toward the heart of the circle. The people who built Avebury were not engineers in the modern sense, but their control of geometry and proportion is striking. The spacing of stones, the curvature of the ditch, and the placement of entrances all reveal mathematical planning. Some researchers believe that the builders may have used simple rope circles and wooden posts to map the design, translating cosmic patterns into the contours of the earth. Yet the geometry never feels rigid. It flows with the land, suggesting an understanding that harmony is achieved not by domination, but by balance. Nearby rises one of the most enigmatic structures of prehistory, Silbury Hill. Standing 30 metres high and covering more than 5 acres, it is the largest man-made mound in Europe. At first glance, it looks like a natural hill, but every layer was built by hand. Thousands of tons of chalk and clay were piled in successive phases, each ringed and compacted with remarkable precision. Radiocarbon dating places its construction around 2,400 years before the Common Era, roughly contemporary with the final phases of Avebury's use. Its purpose remains uncertain, but its scale alone suggests reverence. Silbury Hill's symmetry is nearly perfect. Viewed from above, it forms a flat-topped cone aligned with the River Kennet, which winds nearby like a silver thread through the valley. Excavations show that its builders used antler picks, woven baskets, and wooden shovels to move the material. They dug concentric rings of chalk, gradually building upward layer by layer, maintaining balance as they went. Such an undertaking would have required immense organisation and shared intent. To construct it by hand may have taken decades or generations. What makes Silbury Hill especially fascinating is that it is not a burial mound. Despite extensive excavation, no human remains or treasure have ever been found inside. Instead, it appears to have been deliberately left empty, as if its meaning lay in the act of building itself. Some archaeologists propose that it represented the womb of the earth, a sacred mound mirroring the fertility of the land, perhaps associated with seasonal renewal or ritual ascent. Others suggest it functioned as a giant platform for observation, its height allowing the people of the valley to watch the horizon, the stars, and the gathering of communities below. Together, Avebury and Silbury form what many researchers now call a ritual landscape, an interlocking system of monuments connected by sightlines, pathways, and shared symbolism. The West Kennet Long Barrow, an older burial monument predating both structures, lies just to the south, its passage aligned toward the setting sun. The entire valley seems to have been shaped into a map of belief, where every mound, stone and ditch held meaning. The people here were not just marking space, they were transforming geography into theology. The materials chosen reinforce this sense of symbolism. At Avebury, the rough weathered sarsen stones contrast with the smooth chalk earth of the ditch, representing the duality of permanence and change, sky and soil, order and chaos. The chalk, brilliant white when freshly cut, would have gleamed under sunlight, reflecting the colour of bone or starlight. The stones, in turn, anchored that brightness with shadow. Walking through the site during its prime would have been a sensory experience. Light and dark, sound and silence, rough and smooth textures combining to evoke both life and afterlife. Archaeological studies of pollen and animal remains show that the land around Avebury was managed carefully. Forests were cleared, grasslands maintained, and animals herded in ways that supported large gatherings. The community here was agrarian, yet organised enough to redirect massive labour toward ritual projects. The effort to move and raise stones, to dig ditches and pile chalk, required surplus food and social cohesion, evidence of cooperation across families, clans, and perhaps neighbouring groups. Recent isotopic analysis of human remains found in the region suggests long-distance mobility. Some individuals buried near the Avebury complex came from as far as Western Britain and even continental Europe. This implies that Avebury, like other monumental centres, drew people from afar, a place of pilgrimage and exchange rather than permanent residence. Feasting pits filled with animal bones, broken pottery and burnt flint suggest large seasonal gatherings, possibly aligned with agricultural cycles. The monuments may have served as both calendar and stage for these reunions, where social bonds were renewed through shared ritual labour. The creation of Silbury Hill seems to reflect a similar community effort, a collaboration on a continental scale of imagination. Soil analysis reveals multiple construction episodes, with differing textures and materials brought from distant parts of the region. The act of carrying chalk from various locations may have symbolised uniting different lands into one sacred whole. It is as if the people were literally building a miniature world, a mound containing pieces of everywhere they knew. There is also a powerful environmental element in this story. The late Neolithic climate was beginning to change. Periodic flooding of the Kennet Valley and cooler temperatures may have threatened crops and stability. Building monuments on such a scale could have been a way of negotiating with the environment, not through conquest, but through participation. The earthworks and mounds are like offerings to the landscape, acknowledgements of dependence. By reshaping the terrain, people were also declaring gratitude and continuity, a promise that they would endure alongside the rhythms of the earth itself. Even the acoustics of Avebury hint at ritual intention. The high chalk banks and standing stones create enclosed spaces where sound echoes and hums. A single drumbeat or chant could resonate across the enclosure, amplified by the geometry of the ditch. Experiments have shown that low frequencies, such as the human voice or the sound of animal horns, carry particularly well within the circle. The builders may have understood this intuitively, crafting a monument that spoke back when spoken to. Today, much of Avebury's original form survives. Many of its stones were re-erected after centuries of burial or destruction. Walking its circumference, one can still sense the logic of its design. The vast circular boundary, the smaller inner sanctums, the pathways leading outward like arteries from a heart. Silbury Hill still rises nearby, its grassy slopes blending seamlessly into the valley. From its summit, the entire landscape unfolds as though designed to be seen from that single point, a view that transforms geography into meaning. The mystery of why these people built such structures may never have a single answer. Perhaps the act of creation itself was the ritual, an expression of identity through labour and landscape. Each stone raised and each basket of chalk carried was a gesture of faith in continuity. In that sense, the people who built Avebury and Silbury Hill were writing their own names into the planet, not with words, but with form. Thousands of years later, the monuments still function. They capture light, sound, and attention just as they once did. Standing inside Avebury today, surrounded by its stones and encircled by its immense earthwork, you feel a strange intimacy with the past. The proportions are not overwhelming, they are human, scaled to the rhythm of breath and heartbeat. Silbury Hill too remains a quiet paradox, a mountain built by hand, containing nothing but intention. Perhaps that is the secret buried within this landscape. The people who made it did not build to control nature, but to converse with it. They did not seek immortality through monuments, but harmony through form. They turned the very skin of the earth into memory, a message that still whispers when the wind crosses the chalk plains. Imagine an island rising from the Mediterranean, its rugged hills cut by wind and basalt. Across the slopes towers rise, not castles of kings, but strange circular citadels of stone, older than written history and older than the stories told about them. They stand silent now, thousands of them scattered across Sardinia, each one a dark spiral of basalt blocks, stacked without mortar yet defying time. From above, they look like beehives built for giants. From within, they feel like the skeletons of extinct beliefs. These are the Nuraghe, the enduring monuments of the Nuraghe civilization, a people whose architecture still defines the landscape of an island they once ruled completely. The Nuraghe first appeared around 1,800 years before the Common Era and continued to dominate Sardinia until roughly 1,200 years before the Common Era. Over 7,000 of these structures are known today, though there were once far more. Each follows a basic pattern: a circular tower built from massive basalt or limestone blocks, rising up to 20 metres high, with thick walls enclosing a central chamber shaped like an inverted cone. Inside, a corbelled dome curves overhead, the stones narrowing inward with each layer until they meet in a single keystone at the top. Narrow staircases spiral upward through the thickness of the walls, leading to terraces and smaller upper rooms. From these towers, the Nuraghe people looked out over their valleys, their fields and their herds, but also, perhaps, their gods. Archaeologists still debate their purpose. Some Nuraghe appear purely defensive, positioned on high ridges with commanding views. Others sit within fertile plains or near water sources, suggesting domestic or ritual use. Many are surrounded by clusters of smaller circular huts, entire villages that grew around a central tower. These were not isolated outposts, but living communities. Excavations have uncovered hearths, pottery, grinding stones, and bronze tools inside and around the structures, evidence that daily life and ceremony were intertwined. The tower may have served as a home for a chieftain or guardian, but it also acted as a shrine, a gathering place, and perhaps a symbol of power that reached beyond the living. The engineering alone is remarkable. Without mortar, the Nuraghe builders relied on the precision of their cuts and the sheer weight of the stones to hold everything in place. The corbelled ceilings, some more than 6 metres high, remain intact after more than 3,000 years. Each block could weigh several tons, and yet they were raised with astonishing accuracy using ropes, levers, and wooden scaffolds. The choice of basalt, a volcanic rock both hard and heavy, gave the towers a permanence that outlived empires. Unlike later fortresses built for war, these towers seem designed for endurance rather than aggression. They're too few and too scattered to form a military network. Their strength lies more in presence than in strategy. Some nuraghe, such as the complex of Sunuraxi near Barumini, reveal the civilization's evolution over time. Sunuraxi began as a single central tower around 1,500 years before the Common Era. Over the centuries it expanded into a fortress-like complex of connected towers joined by thick walls, encircling an interior courtyard with a well. Around it, a dense village of circular stone huts grew, each with a central hearth and low stone benches built into the walls. Archaeological evidence shows that the site remained occupied for hundreds of years, its inhabitants adapting and rebuilding through earthquakes, political changes and environmental shifts. The structure was both home and sanctuary, a microcosm of Nuraghic society itself. Bronze metallurgy flourished during this same period, marking Sardinia as one of the most technologically advanced societies of its age. The Nuraghic people crafted finely detailed bronze figurines depicting warriors, priests, animals, and ships. Many of these votive bronzetti were found inside wells, sanctuaries and towers, suggesting that metallurgy and religion were inseparable. The bronze warriors often carry shields and helmets, but their stance is not one of combat. It is ceremonial, almost reverent. These figures may have represented ancestors, spirits, or divine intermediaries. The Nuraghic imagination was clearly both practical and mystical, grounded in metal and earth alike. Water held special meaning in Nuraghic culture. Across Sardinia, archaeologists have found sacred wells and spring temples built with the same precision and corbelled architecture as the towers. The most famous, Santa Cristina, features an underground staircase leading to a subterranean chamber, where light enters through a small opening at the top. During certain times of the year, the reflection of the moon or sun aligns perfectly with the water surface, illuminating the chamber in an ethereal glow. These structures show a mastery of geometry and celestial observation that rivals any of the great monuments of the ancient world. To the Nuragic builders, water and light were forces to be revered, controlled through architecture, and used to bridge the human and the divine. The organisation required to sustain this level of construction suggests a hierarchical society, but not necessarily an empire. The Nuragic civilization had no single capital and left no written records, yet its architectural and artistic consistency across the island implies a shared belief system and coordinated culture. Each community seems to have maintained its own Nuraghe as a symbol of identity, yet all followed a common aesthetic code. Power was likely distributed through clans or chiefdoms, bound together by alliances, marriages, and ritual gatherings. Bronze trade networks connected Sardinia with the wider Mediterranean, and materials such as tin, amber, and obsidian flowed in exchange. But despite contact with other civilizations, the Nuragic people retained a distinctly local character. Their architecture remained massive, circular, and inward-looking, like the island itself. Inside a Nuraghe, the air feels different. The walls breathe coldness. Sound moves strangely. A whisper echoes upward through the dome. Archaeologists studying the acoustics of these chambers have found that the corbelled ceilings amplify low frequencies, creating deep resonant tones when one speaks or sings. Whether intentional or coincidental, this acoustic effect could have contributed to ritual practices, turning the tower itself into a kind of instrument. To stand within one and speak is to feel your voice merge with stone. In such moments, defence and devotion become indistinguishable. The Nuragic worldview seems to have revolved around cycles of seasons, fertility, and light. Their monuments reflect this circular logic. Towers, wells, sanctuaries, and settlements all built upon concentric forms. Even their art favours spirals, sun motifs, and rotational symmetry. The circle was their constant, a geometry of belonging and protection. Within those curves they inscribed the order of their world. By the late Bronze Age, around 1,200 years before the Common Era, the Nuragic culture began to shift. External influences reached the island, trade routes fluctuated, and new technologies emerged. Yet the towers continued to serve as centres of community life long after their original builders were gone. In later centuries, they were reused as shelters, lookouts, or even Christian hermitages. Through all those transformations, their essential form remained intact. The stones held their silence, and their shadows stretched across generations. To modern eyes, the Nuraghe may seem enigmatic, but to the people who built them, their purpose was likely self-evident, a convergence of defence, devotion, and identity. They were not built to dominate, but to endure, to express permanence in a world of uncertainty. Each tower rose from its hill like a promise, that even on an isolated island surrounded by restless seas, humanity could shape basalt into belonging. If you walk among them today, you can still sense that balance. The island's wind moves through the broken stairways, the basalt warms under the Mediterranean sun, and the stones seem to hum with a memory that is not entirely lost. Thousands of towers remain, scattered across Sardinia like punctuation marks in a forgotten language. We may never translate their full meaning, but their grammar is unmistakable, circular, grounded, eternal. In the end, the Nuraghe remind us that architecture began not as a way to separate ourselves from nature, but as a way to speak to it. These basalt spirals are both fortress and prayer, both home and horizon. They are proof that sometimes the most enduring walls are not built to keep the world out, but to hold the sacred within. Imagine a city built where the air is thin enough to make every breath feel like a decision. A world of bright skies and sharp horizons, where the snow peaks of the Andes hang like gods above the plains. There, at nearly 4,000 metres above sea level, people once shaped mountains into geometry. They quarried volcanic stone so hard that modern tools struggle to cut it, then fit those stones together so precisely that not even a blade of grass could slip between them. The city they built was Tiwanaku, the high-altitude heart of an Andean civilization that turned landscape into sacred order. Long before any empire ruled the Andes, Tiwanaku flourished near the southern shores of Lake Titicaca in what is now western Bolivia. Its origins stretch back to around 200 years after the Common Era, and for nearly 8 centuries it grew into a vast urban and ceremonial centre that transformed the Andean world. Here, in one of the most hostile environments ever permanently inhabited, builders raised temples, pyramids and monoliths from stone quarried miles away, creating a metropolis that combined engineering, astronomy and spirituality into one unified design. The first impression of Tiwanaku is not of chaos or ruin, but of precision. The andesite and sandstone blocks are massive, some weighing over 100 tons, yet shaped with geometric perfection. The surfaces are flat, the corners crisp, the joints seamless. Many blocks bear deep interlocking notches, dovetails and T-shaped cutouts, as if designed to fit into larger modular patterns. Archaeologists have found evidence of copper or bronze clamps that once bound certain stones together, inserted into these joints to strengthen the structures. The result is a kind of prehistoric puzzle, a city assembled not from random boulders, but from deliberate logic. One of the most iconic structures is the Akapana Pyramid, a 7-tiered platform rising over 15 metres high. Its terraces were lined with carefully fitted stone blocks, and its interior filled with earth and gravel. The entire shape mirrors the form of a sacred mountain, the Apu, an embodiment of both landscape and divinity. Within its core ran channels carved to direct rainwater, symbolising the flow of life from the heavens into the earth. When the Andean rains fell, water would cascade through the pyramid like veins through a living body. The builders were not just moving soil, they were animating the land. Nearby lies the Cala Sasaya, a vast walled courtyard oriented toward the cardinal directions. Within its sandstone walls stands one of the most extraordinary artefacts of Andean prehistory, the Gate of the Sun. Carved from a single monolithic block of andesite, it weighs nearly 10 tons and stands more than 3 metres tall. At its centre, a winged figure, often interpreted as the staff deity, looks outward, surrounded by 30 rays that resemble both light and tears. Around the figure are smaller winged attendants, arranged in a pattern that some believe corresponds to solar or lunar cycles. During the solstices, sunlight passes through the gateway's opening at precise angles, suggesting that it served as both calendar and cosmic axis. But perhaps the most mysterious structure of all is Puma Punku, the Gate of the Puma, located just to the southwest of the main complex. Here, the stones defy conventional explanation, not because they are alien, as pseudoscience has claimed, but because they reveal an extraordinary understanding of both materials and mathematics. The blocks are made of dense andesite, a volcanic rock that fractures easily under pressure. Yet the builders achieved perfect right angles and mirror-smooth surfaces, even on interior faces that would never be visible. Microscopic analysis suggests they used hammerstones of harder material like quartzite, combined with sand abrasion and possibly controlled heating and cooling to shape the blocks. Some evidence hints at the use of copper alloy tools, which, while softer than the stone, could have been used effectively with patience and skill. Transporting these blocks across the Altiplano required monumental organisation. The nearest known quarries lie over 10 kilometres away, across terrain without large rivers or beasts of burden. Llamas could carry only small loads, and the wheel was unknown. The builders likely used a combination of wooden sledges, rollers, and human labour, possibly lubricating the paths with wet clay or reeds from the lake. Experiments by modern archaeologists show that a team of several hundred people could have moved the stones using ropes and levers. The feat, though immense, was not impossible, only unimaginable in its coordination. Tiwanaku's architectural plan reveals a civilization that saw no boundary between the sacred and the political. The city was laid out as a cosmic map, its major structures aligned to celestial events and the contours of the surrounding mountains. The Classisaya's walls align with sunrise and sunset during the solstices, while sightlines from the Akapena toward the lake correspond to lunar standstills. The urban plan seems to echo the Andean concept of duality, Hanan and Hurin, upper and lower, the balance of opposites that defined both the cosmos and society. Every corner, terrace and axis spoke the language of order and reciprocity. The environment around Tiwanaku demanded that balance. The high plains of the Altiplano experience extremes of temperature, freezing nights, searing days, and a short growing season. Yet the Tiwanaku people turned this harshness into opportunity. They developed raised field agriculture, known as suka kolus, which used elevated planting beds surrounded by water channels. The channels absorbed solar heat during the day and released it at night, protecting crops from frost. This innovation transformed the region into one of the most productive agricultural zones in the Andes, supporting tens of thousands of inhabitants. The surplus enabled specialization, artisans, stonemasons, metallurgists, and priests, all of whom contributed to the city's expansion. At its height, Tiwanaku was likely home to 20 to 40,000 people, with many more living in the surrounding valleys. Excavations have uncovered finely crafted ceramics decorated with complex iconography, textiles woven with llama wool, and metalwork in copper, gold, and silver. The imagery often repeats the same motifs seen in stone: condors, pumas, serpents, and the staff-bearing deity. These symbols appear not as decoration but as cosmological grammar, expressing the unity between the human and the divine. One of the most intriguing aspects of Tiwanaku's legacy lies in its social organization. Unlike later imperial systems, it seems to have functioned less as a militarized state and more as a religious confederation. Its influence spread peacefully across the southern Andes through trade, pilgrimage, and ideology rather than conquest. Colonies and ceremonial centres bearing its distinctive art and architecture appeared hundreds of kilometres away, from northern Chile to southern Peru. Pilgrims likely travelled to the city for festivals aligned with celestial events, bringing goods and knowledge in return. Tiwanaku was both a sanctuary and a school, a high-altitude university of stone. Yet by the 10th century of the Common Era, the city began to decline. The reasons remain uncertain. Climatic evidence from lake sediments points to a prolonged drought that drastically lowered the level of Lake Titicaca. Without water for irrigation, the surrounding fields could no longer sustain the population. As the environment collapsed, so too did the system it supported. The monumental heart of Tiwanaku was gradually abandoned, its once sacred courtyards filling with wind-blown sand. By the time Europeans arrived in the Andes more than 500 years later, the site was already ancient, its builders remembered only through oral fragments. Even in ruin, Tiwanaku retains its presence. The stones still stand as if waiting for their next alignment. The precision of the cuts, the alignment of the gates, the silence of the Altiplano, all combine to create an atmosphere both scientific and spiritual. To walk through its plazas is to feel time slow, as if each stone carries the weight of the mountains it came from. The high altitude sharpens sound and light. The air itself feels engineered. You begin to understand that this city was not meant to dominate its environment, but to converse with it. For the builders of Tiwanaku, architecture was an act of translation, a way of rendering the invisible forces of nature into visible form. Their monuments are neither fortresses nor temples in the narrow sense, but something in between, instruments for synchronizing human life with cosmic rhythm. They carved their understanding of the world into stone, anchoring abstract belief into something that could endure wind, drought, and time. We often imagine technological progress as a straight line, but Tiwanaku reminds us that human genius has always been adaptive. Here, in the thin air of the Altiplano, people mastered the physics of stone, the chemistry of soil, and the astronomy of horizon without writing or wheels. They built a city that still speaks across the centuries, even as its language remains half forgotten. When the sun rises over the Gate of the Sun, its light still passes through the carved portal as it did 1,000 years ago, illuminating the same mountain peaks, the same horizon. The builders are gone, but the alignment remains, a perfect intersection of earth and sky, endurance and idea. Imagine an island city that seems to float, its foundations not on land but on coral and sea. The sound of waves laps against dark volcanic stone. Water channels run like streets through a labyrinth of small artificial islets, each crowned with walls of basalt columns stacked like logs, their hexagonal faces fitting together as if designed by geometry itself. There are no mountains nearby, no beasts of burden, no metal tools to cut or move the rock. Yet hundreds of thousands of tons of stone were somehow transported, lifted, and assembled into a city that still defies comprehension. This is Nan Madol, the Venice of the Pacific, built by the ancient inhabitants of Pohnpei in Micronesia, sometime between 900 and 1200 years after the Common Era. At first glance, Nan Madol seems impossible. Over 90 man-made islets connected by canals spread across a lagoon on Pohnpei's eastern shore. Each platform is formed from columns of prismatic basalt, naturally occurring volcanic stone that fractures into long hexagonal rods. Some weigh several tons and stretch over 5 meters long. These were stacked horizontally and vertically in criss-crossing layers, like immense bundles of stone timber, forming the walls of temples, tombs, and residences. Inside, spaces were filled with coral rubble to raise the platforms above sea level. What emerges is a grid-like cityscape, a network of stone fortresses built atop the sea, 1,000 years before modern engineering would rediscover the challenge of building upon water. The sheer logistics of this project are staggering. Geochemical analysis of the basalt indicates that much of it came from the island's interior, particularly from lava flows near Sokes and other volcanic outcrops several kilometres inland. Without wheels, animals, or iron tools, the builders had to extract these columns from the rock face, transport them down forested slopes, and then across tidal flats and lagoon channels. Archaeologists have proposed several possibilities. The stones could have been floated on rafts during high tide, rolled over palm trunks, or carried by large groups of coordinated labourers. Experiments with smaller basalt prisms suggest that with enough hands, even these immense stones could be manoeuvred using ropes, leverage, and patience. Yet the scale of repetition, thousands upon thousands of columns, required not only ingenuity, but an organised labour system capable of sustained effort over generations. Nan Madol was not a random collection of islets. It was a planned city with distinct zones of power and ceremony. At its heart lay Nandawas, the royal and ritual compound, enclosed by basalt walls nearly 8 metres high and over 70 metres long. Inside stood tombs where members of the ruling Sodelur dynasty were interred. Around it, smaller islets housed priests, attendants, and specialised workers. Some served as kitchens or workshops, others as temples and residences. The city's canal system allowed canoe travel between the islets, turning water into both barrier and pathway, a kind of controlled oceanic choreography that defined the rhythm of life within the city. The builders of Nan Madol were part of the Sodelur polity, a centralised theocratic state that ruled over Pohnpei and its surrounding islands for several centuries. The construction of the city signalled the consolidation of both political and spiritual power. The Sodalur rulers, believed to be semi-divine, used the city as both capital and temple complex. Its isolation, built on coral platforms separated from the main island, reinforced the sacred distance between rulers and subjects. Access was restricted, and many of the islets were dedicated to specific rituals, including offerings, burials, and initiation ceremonies. The structure of the city mirrored the structure of authority itself. Archaeologists studying the site have identified over 100 distinct artificial islets, each constructed with precise orientation and purpose. The largest, Madol Pa and Madol Pau, formed the administrative and ceremonial centres. Some islets contain deep basalt-lined wells filled with brackish water, possibly used for ritual purification. Others hold the remains of ovens and hearths, showing that food preparation was centralised, perhaps to feed the workers or supply offerings for ceremonies. The outer islets seem to have housed commoners, guards and service dwellers, forming a gradient of access that moved inward toward the sacred heart of Nandawas. The decision to build on water was not simply aesthetic. In Micronesian cosmology, water represented both origin and boundary, the separation between the human and the ancestral, between land and spirit. By constructing their capital atop coral and sea, the Sodalur transformed the lagoon into sacred architecture, a physical expression of divine order imposed upon chaos. The coral foundations symbolise stability amid the shifting tides. The basalt walls rose as monuments to permanence in a world of motion. The result was a city that existed between worlds, half earth, half ocean. Nan Madol's basalt construction also reveals a deep understanding of material properties. The prismatic columns were laid with alternating orientations, creating interlocking strength and allowing the structures to flex slightly under tidal pressure. This technique gave the walls both stability and resilience, preventing collapse in the face of storms and shifting coral bases. Coral fill within the foundations provided drainage and buoyancy, keeping the structures above water even as the tides rose and fell. In effect, Nan Madol's builders invented a form of floating architecture, a living balance between geology and oceanography. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of advanced social organisation supporting this monumental project. Analysis of food remains shows that the city relied on tribute from the island's hinterlands. Taro, breadfruit, fish, and shellfish delivered regularly to sustain the population. Tools of shell and coral were used for shaping and polishing the basalt, and fragments of pottery and ornaments suggest a stratified society with artisans and elites. The presence of large tombs, some containing grave goods and human remains, confirms that Nan Madol was as much necropolis as metropolis. It was a city of the living built in service to the dead. The Sodalur dynasty that built and ruled Nan Madol eventually declined, possibly due to environmental exhaustion or internal conflict. Deforestation for construction and agriculture may have altered the island's hydrology, reducing fertility and freshwater availability. Oral histories from later Pohnpeian traditions speak of tyranny and collapse, of rulers who demanded tribute beyond what the land could give. When the city was finally abandoned around the 12th century of the Common Era, its canals filled slowly with silt and its stone walls began to sink back into the sea. Yet even in ruin, it retained an eerie perfection, the lines straight, the geometry intact, the silence absolute. Modern archaeologists continue to study how Nan Madol's builders managed to move and stack the basalt columns so precisely. Geochemical fingerprinting of individual stones confirms multiple quarry sources across the island, implying a coordinated logistics network for gathering and transporting material. Some of the columns bear marks suggesting controlled splitting through heating and cooling, the use of fire and water to fracture rock along its natural joints. Others were shaped by hammering and abrasion, their edges smoothed by hours of labour. Each column is unique, yet together they form walls that look mathematical in their order. Beyond its technical brilliance, Nan Madol challenges our assumptions about isolation and scale. It demonstrates that complex urban planning, monumental architecture and centralised authority could develop independently in the islands of the Pacific, far from the great river valleys or continental cores that dominate historical narratives. Its creators were navigators and engineers, but also cosmologists, people who saw no division between constructing a city and shaping a cosmos. Today, much of Nan Madol remains half submerged, its canals still navigable by canoe. Mangroves grow between the basalt walls, and fish swim through the flooded courtyards. When the tide rises, the city reawakens. Shadows of walls glimmer beneath the water, and the ocean fills the spaces once filled by ritual. Seen from above, the pattern of islets still mirrors the order of its builders, a frozen map of power and devotion drawn in stone. To stand there now, amid the black basalt ruins and the whispering sea, is to sense both endurance and fragility. The city's foundations rest on coral, its walls on faith, its survival on balance. For 1,000 years it has resisted the sea's slow reclamation, but it was always meant to belong partly to the water. That may be its greatest secret, that permanence was never the goal. Nan Madol is not the monument of an empire seeking eternity, but of a people seeking harmony. They did not conquer the ocean, they invited it in. They made the tides their streets, the coral their ground, the basalt their prayer. The city still floats, caught between worlds, proving that civilization does not require land to take root, only imagination strong enough to build upon the impossible. Imagine an island so far from any other land that the horizon is nothing but water, and yet its slopes are filled with the gaze of stone giants. They face inland, away from the endless ocean that surrounds them, their eyes fixed on a world long vanished. The light shifts, and hundreds of profiles emerge, solemn, elongated, each carved from volcanic tuff, each unique, each still watching. These are the Moai of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, carved by the ancestors of a small Polynesian community that managed to turn isolation into art on a scale that remains unmatched in the Pacific. The first settlers arrived on Rapa Nui sometime between 800 and 1200 years after the Common Era, navigating thousands of kilometres across open ocean. They brought with them the memory of navigation, seeds, chickens, and the fire of their own mythology. For centuries they lived in relative isolation. The nearest inhabited land lay more than 2,000 kilometres away. In that solitude they began to shape stone into lineage, turning rock faces into family. Between 1200 and 1500 years after the Common Era, the islanders quarried, carved and raised nearly 900 moai, monumental statues that transformed the entire island into a sacred landscape of memory. Each moai was more than a monument. It was a person, or rather, an ancestor. The Rapa Nui believed that power, or mana, flowed from the ancestors into the living. The moai embodied that power, standing as guardians of their clans, facing inland to watch over the people and their cultivated fields. The statue's eyes once gleamed with white coral and red scoria pupils, turning them into living presences. From their stone platforms, known as ahu, the moai formed lines of ancestral authority, watching the daily life of their descendants and binding the community together through memory. The process of creation began at the quarry of Nuraghe, a volcanic crater whose tuff, a soft compressed ash stone, provided the perfect carving material. The slopes of the quarry still bear the frozen remains of that labour, unfinished statues in every stage of completion, some half buried, others still attached to the bedrock as if the carvers had stepped away only yesterday. To carve a moai, artisans used basalt picks and chisels, pounding slowly, flake by flake, to shape the head, torso and back. The average statue stands about 4 metres tall and weighs 12 tons, but some reach heights of over 10 metres. The largest ever attempted, still lying in the quarry, would have stood 20 metres high and weighed over 200 tons if completed. Carving was only the beginning. Once shaped, the Moai had to be moved from the quarry to their ahu platforms, sometimes kilometres away. For decades, researchers debated how the islanders accomplished this without wheels, metal or draft animals. Theories ranged from sliding the statues on wooden sledges to rolling them on logs, but modern experiments conducted in collaboration with local Rapa Nui elders have shown something more elegant and far more human. By tying ropes around the head and base, teams of people could walk the statues upright, rocking them gently from side to side along prepared paths, just as one might move a heavy refrigerator today. This method not only explains the distinct wear patterns on the statues' bases, but also echoes oral traditions describing the Moai as walking with mana, the spiritual energy of the ancestors themselves. The ahu platforms that hold the Moast were feats of engineering in their own right. Built from fitted basalt blocks and coral foundations, they stabilised the statues against earthquakes and erosion. Many also contained burial chambers for important clan leaders, physically uniting the dead with their stone representations. Around these ceremonial centres, villages grew, complete with stone houses, hearths, and agricultural terraces. The landscape of Rapa Nui thus became a living genealogy, each Moai a node in a network of lineage, faith and survival. For a long time, the popular narrative of Rapa Nui centred on tragedy, the idea of ecological collapse, of a people who destroyed their forest to build their monuments, leaving only barren soil and fallen statues. It is an appealing parable, but evidence tells a more complex and perhaps more hopeful story. Pollen analysis from lake sediments shows that while palm forests did decline over time, the process was gradual and influenced by multiple factors, including climate fluctuations and the introduction of the Polynesian rat, which prevented palm regeneration by eating seeds. Yet even as trees disappeared, the islanders adapted. Instead of environmental ruin, we find innovation. Archaeologists have uncovered extensive rock gardens, known as manavai, where volcanic stones were used to trap moisture and protect crops from wind and evaporation. Beneath the rocky mulch, the soil retained fertility, allowing the cultivation of sweet potatoes, yams and taro even in dry seasons. Isotopic studies of ancient human remains show stable, consistent diets over centuries, evidence not of starvation, but of continuity. The people of Rapa Nui learned to thrive in scarcity, engineering their landscape as carefully as they had engineered their statues. The Moai building period did not end suddenly, but evolved as social structures changed. Around 1500 years after the Common Era, the construction of large statues declined, and new ritual forms emerged. The rise of the Birdman cult shifted focus from ancestral monuments to annual competitions linked to fertility and seabird migration. But even this transition reflected adaptation, not collapse. The island society restructured itself around new spiritual symbols while preserving its communal foundation. When European explorers first arrived in the 18th century, they found a population still deeply rooted in its traditions, though already strained by external contact and introduced disease. Each fallen Moai tells its own story. Some were toppled by internal conflicts, others by time or earthquake. Many still lie where they fell, half buried by centuries of erosion. Yet even in ruin, they preserve the dignity of their builders. The faces remain serene, their features both stylized and human, broad noses, deep brows, compressed lips suggesting patience or quiet authority. Their backs bear faint carvings, symbols of birds, canoes, or geometric motifs, perhaps clan marks or prayers. Together they form one of humanity's most haunting archives, a library of ancestors carved in stone. Modern archaeological surveys have revealed how deeply integrated the Moai were with every aspect of Rapa Nui's ecology and economy. The roads leading from the quarry radiate outward like arteries, connecting each ahu to a wider sacred network. The orientation of many Moai corresponds with freshwater springs hidden in the coastal lava flows, suggesting that the statues may also have marked sources of life-giving water. In this light, the Moai were not only ancestral figures but waypoints in a landscape of survival, guardians watching over the most precious resources of an island world. The technology of carving and moving the Moai reveals another truth often overlooked: cooperation. The construction of a single statue required the coordinated labour of dozens of people, from carvers to rope makers to platform builders. It demanded surplus food, planning and trust, the same ingredients required to sustain a small, isolated community across centuries. The Moai were thus products not of wasteful ambition, but of social cohesion. They were how a small society made permanence out of impermanence. When you stand before a Moai today, the silence feels heavier than the stone itself. The wind moves across the volcanic plain, and for a moment you understand why they all face inward, toward the land, the people, the lineage that made them. The ocean they turn away from is both their prison and their memory. It is the vastness from which their ancestors came, and the barrier that kept them here. To face the sea would be to stare into the past. To face the land is to watch the future. The Rapa Nui story, when told carefully, is not one of hubris or ruin. It is a story of endurance, of how humans, even in isolation, continue to find meaning through creation. The islanders did not destroy themselves in pursuit of glory. They adapted, reshaped, and remembered. The Moai still stand because they were never only statues. They were conversations between generations, carved in volcanic breath, lifted with communal strength, and placed where faith met earth. And even now, centuries later, they still do what they were made to do. They watch. Imagine walking through a city made entirely of stone, no mortar, no iron, just gravity and precision. The walls curve like waves frozen in mid-motion, some over 10 metres high, their granite blocks fitted so tightly that they almost seem grown together. At the heart of this city rises a massive enclosure, within it a mysterious conical tower, silent and solid as a drum. This is Great Zimbabwe, built in southern Africa nearly 1,000 years ago, a place where architecture itself became language. The grammar of power, belief and belonging spoken through stone. The city of Great Zimbabwe emerged between 1100 and 1450 years after the Common Era in the highlands of what is now Zimbabwe. Its name, derived from the Shona phrase Zimbadzamabwa, houses of stone, describes not just a structure, but an entire civilization. For centuries it served as the political and spiritual centre of a vast state that controlled trade across southern Africa, connecting local goldfields to coastal merchants, and, beyond them, to the Indian Ocean world. Yet for much of modern history, outsiders refused to believe that Africans had built it. Early European explorers, confronted with its scale and elegance, attributed it to Phoenicians, Arabs, or lost white civilizations. Only archaeology, patient, methodical, and humble, restored the truth. Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, for Africans, using an architectural language entirely their own. The site covers roughly 700 hectares and consists of 3 main zones: the hill complex, the Great Enclosure, and the valley ruins. The hill complex rises atop a granite ridge, a natural fortress encircled by stone walls that snake around its contours. It was likely the earliest royal residence, a symbolic and strategic seat of power overlooking the valley below. The Great Enclosure, situated on the plain, stands as the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa, an elliptical wall enclosing nearly 3 acres of space. Its outer wall measures over 250 metres in circumference, curving in rhythmic arcs with neither symmetry nor straight lines. Within it, a second inner wall creates narrow passageways that seem designed to guide movement and control access. At its centre stands the conical tower, 25 feet tall, built of carefully coursed stone with no doorway or opening. Its function remains uncertain, but its symbolism is unmistakable, a monument of authority, fertility, and continuity. The builders of Great Zimbabwe used locally available granite, which fractures naturally into angular blocks when exposed to heat and weather. These blocks were shaped minimally, then laid in dry courses without mortar. Stability was achieved through mass and geometry, walls thicker at the base tapering upward, their stones slightly inward leaning to resist collapse. Curvature added strength and beauty. The city's architecture follows the logic of the land rather than imposing upon it. Each structure sits harmoniously with its surrounding boulders, suggesting a world view in which human construction extends nature rather than replaces it. Inside the enclosures, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of elite residences. Dega huts made of clay and wood, raised on stone foundations. The arrangement of living spaces, courtyards and pathways reflects a social hierarchy embedded in architecture. The innermost enclosures likely housed royal families and religious specialists, while outer zones supported artisans, traders and labourers. Yet despite its stratification, the settlement was not a fortress in the militaristic sense. The walls divide, conceal and impress, but they do not fortify. Great Zimbabwe was built to express power, not to defend it. Trade was the lifeblood of the city. Excavations have revealed glass beads from India, porcelain from China, and coins from Persia, all exchanged for local gold, ivory and animal products. From the mines along the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers, gold travelled to the coast, where Swahili merchants shipped it across the Indian Ocean. Great Zimbabwe sat at the nexus of this network, a node where regional resources met global demand. The ruling elite controlled access to both trade and cattle, accumulating wealth that was displayed not through ostentatious palaces, but through monumental stonework. Architecture became a political statement, permanence against time, mastery over landscape, order over distance. The site's layout also reveals sophisticated planning and symbolism. The great enclosure's curved walls create acoustic effects. A single voice can carry clearly through the narrow corridors, suggesting deliberate design for ceremonial processions or ritual announcements. The conical tower may have represented a granary, a traditional symbol of prosperity, and the ruler's capacity to feed his people. Shona oral traditions associate kingship with fertility and the land's abundance, and this architectural metaphor fits seamlessly within that worldview. The walls were not barriers but mediators between the visible and the sacred. Nearby, the hill complex served as a ritual and administrative hub. Archaeologists have found carved soapstone birds there, elegant sculptures perched on pillars, their forms part eagle, part human, their meaning layered and subtle. These birds likely embodied ancestral guardianship and political authority, precursors to the symbol still found on Zimbabwe's national flag. Their presence among royal enclosures suggests that spiritual legitimacy and political power were inseparable. To rule was not only to command, but to mediate between the ancestors and the living. What is remarkable about Great Zimbabwe is how its grandeur coexists with ecological restraint. The city's builders quarried local stone, shaped it minimally, and built without deforestation or large-scale destruction. Even the clay used for huts was recycled each generation. Environmental evidence from pollen and soil samples shows no sign of sudden collapse or overuse of resources. When the city declined in the 15th century, it was not because of exhaustion or catastrophe, but likely due to shifts in trade routes and political centres. As coastal commerce moved northward, power followed. Great Zimbabwe's population dispersed, its authority giving rise to successor states like Kami and Mutapa, which continued its architectural and economic traditions. The rediscovery of Great Zimbabwe by Europeans in the 19th century became a mirror for their prejudices. Early colonial explorers could not accept that African societies were capable of such complexity. Excavations were distorted by ideology, artefacts selectively interpreted, evidence erased. It took the careful work of later archaeologists like Gertrude Caton Thompson in the 1930s to prove, conclusively and scientifically, that the builders were the ancestors of the Shona people. Her conclusion, simple yet revolutionary, restored the site to its rightful lineage. Examination of the evidence reveals nothing inconsistent with the known culture of African peoples. In other words, Africa had built itself. Standing inside the great enclosure today, the silence feels deliberate. The granite absorbs sound, the curved walls bend light. You can sense the presence of the thousands who once lived here. Stonemasons, herders, traders and priests, all moving through corridors that still carry the scent of earth and history. The walls, though weathered, have not fallen. They remain locked by gravity, the same force that once bound the city together. The precision of construction continues to astonish engineers. Laser surveys show that the wall courses maintain consistent tilt and curvature across long spans, evidence of mathematical understanding achieved through observation, not formula. Each block was placed by feel, by hand, by weight, by instinct refined across generations. The builders worked with nature's logic, letting the stone tell them how it wanted to stand. In that way, Great Zimbabwe is not only a monument of human achievement, but also a collaboration between geology and imagination. Artifacts found within the site expand the portrait of its people. Spindle whorls, iron tools, gold ornaments and pottery etched with intricate geometric patterns. Together they reveal a culture that valued both practicality and artistry. Their craftsmanship extended beyond survival. It reached for elegance. The same aesthetic rhythm found in pottery spirals through the city's architecture, suggesting a continuity between household and horizon. Even the distribution of cattle enclosures around the valley points to the integration of economy, belief, and landscape. Cattle were wealth, but they were also spiritual capital, essential for ritual offerings that bound the community to its ancestors. The royal compounds near the hill complex controlled this flow, reinforcing the ruler's central role as mediator of prosperity. Power here was circular, like the walls themselves, radiating outward from sacred centres to everyday life. To understand Great Zimbabwe is to understand how architecture can become philosophy. It expresses not dominance but connection to land, to lineage, to the unseen. Its walls curve because the world does. Its stones fit together because society must. The city's genius lies in how it turns material into metaphor, how it proves that stone in the right hands can speak. Centuries later, the site endures not only as an archaeological wonder, but as a lesson in interpretation. For generations, its existence was rewritten to fit colonial narratives that denied African agency. Restoring its story has been an act of intellectual repatriation, returning to the stones their original meaning. Today, Great Zimbabwe stands not as a relic of mystery, but as testimony to indigenous genius. And perhaps that is its truest power. The granite blocks have no mortar, yet they hold. The civilization left no written words, yet its voice still echoes. It reminds us that complexity does not require conquest, and sophistication does not depend on imitation. Great Zimbabwe was never lost, only misread. Imagine a hill that isn't what it seems, a green forested rise in West Java that may, beneath its soil and stones, hide one of the oldest human structures on Earth. To the untrained eye, Gunung Padang looks natural, a volcanic ridge covered in grasses, shrubs and columnar basalt blocks arranged in weathered terraces. But under the ground, recent excavations have suggested something far more complex, a layered construction that might predate agriculture itself. The question, as always in archaeology, is not just what the evidence shows, but how carefully we choose to see it. Gunung Padang lies roughly 120 kilometres south of Jakarta, rising nearly 900 metres above sea level. Its name means mountain of light in the local Sundanese language, an oddly fitting phrase for a site that has drawn both illumination and confusion in equal measure. For generations, local people treated it as sacred ground, a place of quiet reverence and ancestral power. The visible part of the site consists of 5-stepped terraces built from volcanic andesite columns, roughly hexagonal in shape, set upright or laid flat like natural Lego pieces. Between them are stone walls, stairways and platforms, some partially collapsed, some perfectly intact. From the top terrace, the surrounding valleys stretch out in all directions, wrapped in mist and bird song, a place made for ceremony, perhaps, or observation. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists dated Gunung Padang to the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, around 5,000 years ago, based on surface artefacts and the weathering of its stones. That alone would make it one of the oldest megalithic sites in Southeast Asia. But in the past 2 decades, newer studies have added a controversial twist. Core drilling and ground-penetrating radar have revealed deeper structures beneath the terraces, layers of worked stone extending tens of metres underground. Radiocarbon samples taken from soils between these layers have returned surprisingly ancient dates, some as early as 12,000 years before the present. If these results were confirmed beyond doubt, Gunung Padang would upend the accepted timeline of human construction. It would mean that people in this part of Indonesia, long before the first farmers of Mesopotamia or the builders of Göbekli Tepe, were shaping stone on a monumental scale. But science, by its nature, is cautious. Dating is only as reliable as context, and context at Gunung Padang is difficult to pin down. The radiocarbon ages come not from carved stone or bones, but from organic materials trapped in soil layers whose relationship to the structure remains uncertain. Are those layers part of the monument's construction, or simply older earth through which later builders dug? The team behind the recent excavations has argued for the former, suggesting a multi-phase construction process spanning thousands of years. According to their model, an original core of andesite masonry was built perhaps as early as 12,000 BCE, later buried and then re-terraced by subsequent cultures. To test this, geophysicists drilled into the hill and mapped density variations consistent with voids or chambers. Some interpretations propose artificially arranged stone volumes at depths of up to 15 metres, too geometrically regular, they argue, to be natural lava formations. Others, including many international researchers, remain unconvinced. Columnar basalt can fracture and settle in ways that mimic architecture, and radiocarbon contamination is notoriously easy in tropical soils. What makes Gunung Padang so fascinating isn't just the possibility of its age, it's the tension between imagination and verification. Archaeology has always lived in that fragile space between wonder and skepticism. The desire to find the oldest of anything, the first temple, the first pyramid, the first proof of civilization, is deeply human. It satisfies our longing for origin stories. But as science matures, it also learns to resist premature conclusions. At Gunung Padang, that resistance is itself part of the story. Standing on the terraces, the stones speak in patterns rather than words. They are arranged in lines and clusters, oriented roughly northwest-southeast, perhaps toward ancient solar paths or mountain horizons. Some of the upright pillars form small enclosures, Others mark what may have been ritual platforms. The basalt columns are jointed naturally by volcanic cooling, but have clearly been moved and set by human hands. Whether this construction dates back 5,000 or 12,000 years, it testifies to cooperation and intentionality, the mental architecture of a society capable of planning, aligning, and remembering. The surrounding region supports that picture. West Java's ancient landscapes are rich with megalithic traditions, standing stones, dolmens and burial mounds built by agricultural communities long before written history. Ethnographic parallels from the Sunda Highlands show that such structures often served as both tombs and ceremonial centres, connecting the living to ancestral spirits believed to inhabit the mountains. In this cultural continuity, Gunung Padang's visible terraces make perfect sense. The question of deeper layers, however, belongs to geology as much as to archaeology. Core samples from the hill reveal alternating zones of weathered basalt, clay and soil, with patches of anomalous compaction that could represent human reworking. But geological formations can deceive. Lava flows, ancient landslides, and erosion can all produce the illusion of layered construction. Distinguishing natural stratigraphy from cultural modification requires exhaustive cross-checking, sediment analysis, microfossil examination, and independent dating from multiple labs. That process takes years, not weeks. Science frustratingly moves slower than headlines. What is beyond debate is that Gunung Padang's top terraces are man-made and remarkably well preserved. Excavations have found pottery fragments, stone tools, and traces of fire use. Local oral traditions describe it as a place of kings and ancestors, a sanctuary for reflection rather than residence. There are no signs of domestic life, no hearths, no refuse pits, suggesting that it was used intermittently, perhaps seasonally, for communal ritual. The terracing itself would have required hundreds of workers hauling basalt columns up steep slopes, aligning them with minimal tools guided by shared memory and meaning. In that sense, Gunung Padang fits comfortably into the global story of early monumentality, a phase when humans began to translate belonging into landscape, long before writing or metal. To understand the controversy around its dating, it helps to remember how scientific knowledge grows. Every extraordinary claim demands extraordinary evidence, and the burden of proof lies with the claimant. When core samples suggest unexpected antiquity, other researchers must replicate those results under controlled conditions. When structures appear geometric, they must be compared against natural analogues. It is this process of review and replication that protects science from its own excitement. Skepticism is not denial, it is care. Without it, we drift into myth. And at Gunung Padang, the mythic temptation is strong. The site's atmosphere, with its misty ridges and brooding stones, invites cosmic thinking. But true wonder survives scrutiny. If, after rigorous testing, the deeper layers do prove to be artificial and truly ancient, it would expand our understanding of Southeast Asia's prehistory, showing that complex construction arose in multiple centres across the world. If not, the site remains a remarkable example of later Neolithic architecture rooted in deep local tradition. Either way, the stones endure, and so does our curiosity. One of the quiet lessons of Gunung Padang is that mystery itself is not failure. Science advances by refining uncertainty, not erasing it. Every new drill core, every laboratory recheck, every argument between field geologists and archaeologists adds resolution to the picture. The truth may turn out to be less sensational than some hope, but more meaningful than it first appeared, a testament to the patience required to know anything at all about the deep past. The people who built on this hill, whenever they did, were part of that same patience. They observed the world long enough to understand stone. They shaped their surroundings in ways that outlasted every name and story. Their descendants still visit the terraces, leaving offerings of flowers and incense, not to worship but to remember. In a way, that living continuity may be the oldest layer of all. So perhaps Gunung Padang's mystery lies not in its depth or its age, but in what it reveals about us. We crave origins because we crave belonging. We dig into hills to find beginnings, but sometimes the oldest truths are about the present, about humility, evidence, and the endurance of questions. Imagine this. You stand before the last stone. The wind moves through the cracks where ancient hands once pressed, where tools once shaped intention into permanence. Around you, the others have fallen. 16 monuments scattered across continents, each whispering something slightly different, yet bound by the same impulse to last. But here, on this quiet hill of imagination, only one remains upright, the 17th. And it isn't made of basalt or sandstone, nor does it belong to any one place. It lives inside the mind that remembers them all. The last monument is us. Across hundreds of millennia, humanity has built, rebuilt, and rebuilt again. Cairns, mounds, circles, and walls that never truly stayed. Time does what rain and roots cannot. It erases. And yet what these stones began survives in a way they never could, as memory, cognition, story. Long before we invented writing, we learned to build meaning. The first monuments were not architecture but awareness itself. The ability to hold an image in the mind longer than it existed before the eyes. Every megalith, every carved face, every mound of shaped earth is a fossil of that awareness. We were not merely trying to mark territory or worship gods. We were trying to remember that we were here. Archaeology tells us that building is older than civilization. The drive to arrange the world into pattern begins deep in the Paleolithic, when hunter-gatherers started leaving stones upright, arranging bones in circles, or carving lines that meant something to someone. The walls of Göbekli Tepe were not just a place of gathering. They were an extension of the human nervous system. Through building, cognition became visible. To stand a pillar upright was to take an invisible thought and make it permanent. The real revolution wasn't in agriculture or metallurgy, but in consciousness deciding it could endure outside the body. From Anatolia to Orkney, from the Pacific lagoons to the African savanna, the stones multiplied. Each one a neural spark made solid, each community adding its own grammar to this language of endurance. Some used geometry, others symmetry. Some oriented their lives toward the sky, others toward the ancestors below. But all of them, every wall, circle and tower, were built from the same fragile conviction that meaning could resist entropy. That we could leave a shape behind the time would have to walk around. And yet the irony of stone is that it is never still. Even the heaviest blocks shift and sink, pulled by gravity, cracked by frost. The monuments that seem eternal are always, invisibly, in motion. Archaeologists can measure that drift in millimeters per century. But in our own minds the drift is faster. Civilizations forget faster than stones erode. The builders of Carnac, Nabta Playa, and Great Zimbabwe are names we'll never recover. But their actions remain as equations of intent. A pillar aligned to the solstice is not a superstition. It's an early proof of precision, a statement that the human eye can measure the cosmos. We inherited that precision, but also that uncertainty. We no longer carve granite with copper chisels, but we still build to understand ourselves. We raise instruments, telescopes, accelerators, new kinds of megaliths that measure time instead of marking it. When we look at their ancestors, it's easy to romanticize the mystery, to project divinity onto the unknown. But mystery is not a flaw in knowledge. It is the constant state of being human. The people who built these monuments didn't have all the answers either. They were experimenting with the world's raw material, belief. Every stone circle, every temple, every mound begins as a question. And that question echoes louder than the architecture itself. What if we could make something that lasts longer than we do? What if the dead could still feel the dawn? What if alignment could bring us closer to order? These were not superstitions. They were hypotheses in the only medium early humanity had: stone, sun, and memory. When we study them today, we tend to ask what they believed in. But perhaps the deeper question is what they feared losing. Every monument, in its own way, is an act against forgetting. To stack stone upon stone is to say, remember. Remember the stars, the seasons, the ancestors, the stories, the reasons. When the oral world was fragile, monuments were backup drives for the human mind, memory externalized into landscape. And that brings us back to the 17th monument, the one that didn't need stone. It is carved from neurons and time, layered with the same sediment of memory and myth. When you look at a ruin and feel something stir, that is it. The structure within that answers across 10,000 years. The human brain remembers more than its own lifetime. Inside its architecture lies the same pattern as Göbekli Tepe's pillars, the same geometry as Newgrange's passageway, a network of alignment and attention, linking observation to meaning. We once believed we built monuments to gods, but what if we built them for ourselves, to test the endurance of awareness? Every terrace, every carved face, every tower on every continent is part of one long continuity of mind, the first species learning to translate awe into architecture. Even when the builders died, their questions didn't. They lived on in whoever came next, puzzling over the same constellations, the same winters, the same rise of light over stone. When you walk among the ruins now, you can feel that conversation still happening. The stones don't speak, but they listen. They wait for someone who understands that building is thinking. Slow, deliberate, physical thinking. To build is to imagine that the future will arrive, that someone someday will stand where you stand and try to read what you wrote in material form. And if that future listener cannot read your words, they can at least read your intention. We want it to last. The 17th monument is not just memory. It is the awareness of mortality. Somewhere between quarry and altar, humanity learned to recognize impermanence, not just resist it. The builders of Tiwanaku cut andesite until it fit with impossible precision, because precision itself was a form of faith. The sculptors of Rapa Nui lifted faces toward the horizon, because facing forward was the only way to confront time. The masons of Great Zimbabwe curved their walls because perfection was not the goal. Containment was. To make space for meaning, not mastery. And yet, if you think carefully, the pattern is consistent. Across oceans and millennia, humans have always tried to connect the transient to the eternal. We built in stone not to escape nature, but to join it, to freeze a moment of belonging in a material that outlives thought. In that sense, the act of building is the act of remembering that we belong to something older than ourselves. You can feel that lineage every time you stand in silence before a ruin. That strange mix of humility and pride. Pride that our kind could lift such weight. Humility that it will all fall again. Even the pyramids will one day be sand. But the idea of a monument, that compulsion to order chaos into meaning, is indestructible. It's the same cognitive signature found in a hand stencil on a cave wall, a ring of stones in a desert, or a steel beam raised in a modern skyline. The form changes, the function endures. So when you think of the great megaliths, from Göbekli Tepe's carved pillars to the Moai facing the endless sea, remember that each one was less a temple than a mirror. They reflected the mind of a species learning that memory could outlive muscle. And though we have changed our tools, the impulse remains. We still measure, align, and wonder. We still chase the dawn through corridors of stone and light. We still mark time in the hope that meaning will follow. The 17th monument does not need to be built. It already stands in every mind capable of wonder. It is the quiet realization that the act of remembering is itself an architecture. Neurons firing in patterns older than language, tracing echoes of ancient alignments, of people who looked at the same sky and asked the same questions. The stones may have taught us engineering, but what they truly built was empathy across time. As night falls on the last terrace and the final shadow merges with the landscape, what remains is not the ruin, but the recognition. We are the continuation of those hands, those eyes, those thoughts. We carry within us the memory of every builder, every carver, every observer of the sky. And that is what endures. Not the monument, but the mind that made it necessary. The stones did not make us divine. They made us aware of time. And as always, stay curious, stay calm,